thought she was just another peasant begging for charity. He laughed at her in front of his court, mocking her size, her voice, even her hope. But what she said, and what happened next, changed everything. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The morning sun rose reluctantly over the ancient stones of Ravenshold Castle, casting long shadows across the frost-covered courtyard, where servants scurried about their duties like ants disturbed from their hill. The air was sharp and bitter, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and freshly baked bread from the kitchens below. Winter had settled its heavy hand upon the English countryside, transforming the rolling hills into a landscape of white and gray, where bare trees reached skeletal fingers toward a pewter sky that promised more snow before nightfall. Prince Edmund of Ravenshold stood at the tall arched window of the great hall, his silhouette framed by the weak winter light that struggled to penetrate the thick glass panes. At 26 years of age, he was the very image of masculine nobility, tall and powerfully built with broad shoulders that spoke of countless hours spent training with sword and lance. His dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, framing a face that could have been carved from marble by the finest sculptors of antiquity. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw covered with a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes the color of storm clouds gave him an appearance that commanded both respect and admiration. He wore a tunic of deep burgundy wool, embroidered with golden thread in intricate patterns that caught the light, over which lay a vest of supple black leather trimmed with wolf fur. A heavy cloak of charcoal gray hung from his shoulders, fastened with a silver brooch bearing the raven sigil of his house. Yet despite his impressive appearance, there was something cold in Edmund's bearing, a hardness around his eyes that suggested a man who had grown accustomed to privilege and had forgotten the weight of compassion. He turned from the window with an expression of profound boredom etched across his handsome features, his fingers drumming impatiently against the pommel of the ceremonial sword that hung at his hip. "Your Highness," called Lord Percival Thornwood, the castle's steward, as he approached with quick, nervous steps that echoed against the stone floor. The older man was thin as a reed, with graying hair and a perpetually worried expression that had deepened into permanent lines across his forehead. He wore robes of dark green wool with silver fastenings, befitting his position, though they hung somewhat loosely on his spare frame. "The petitioners are gathered in the outer bailey, awaiting your pleasure. Shall I have them brought forward for audience?" Edmund sighed heavily, his breath misting in the cold air of the hall despite the massive fireplace that roared at the far end of the chamber. The great hall of Ravenshold was a magnificent space, its vaulted ceiling supported by thick columns carved with the history of his lineage. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes and ancient battles hung from the walls, their rich colors muted by age and the dim light. The floor was covered with fresh rushes mixed with dried lavender and rosemary, their scent mingling with the ever-present smell of smoke and stone that permeated every medieval fortress. "Petitioners," Edmund repeated the word with distaste, as though it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "What tiresome requests do they bring today, Percival? More complaints about taxes? Disputes over boundary stones? The endless whining of peasants who cannot manage their own affairs?" Lord Thornwood shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasping and unclasping before him in a gesture of nervous anxiety. "Your Highness, it is the duty of the crown to hear the grievances of the people. Your father, may God rest his soul, always made time for those who sought his counsel and aid." The mention of his late father caused Edmund's expression to darken further, a shadow passing across his features like clouds obscuring the sun. King Harold had died only 6 months prior, leaving Edmund as the ruling prince of this northern territory while his elder brother prepared to ascend the throne in London. The weight of responsibility had not softened Edmund's character. Rather, it had made him more irritable, more prone to dismissing those he considered beneath his station. "My father was too soft," Edmund replied curtly, moving away from the window toward the throne that sat upon a raised dais at the far end of the hall. It was a massive chair of carved oak, cushioned with red velvet that had faded to a dull crimson over the years. He spent hours listening to every farmer who lost a sheep or every merchant who felt cheated by a copper coin. "I have more important matters to attend to." "Nevertheless, Your Highness," Percival pressed gently, "the people have traveled far in this harsh weather to seek audience. Some have been waiting since before dawn. It would be seen as a kindness to hear them, even briefly." Edmund waved his hand dismissively as he settled into the throne, arranging his cloak around him with practiced ease. "Very well, bring them forth. But keep the proceedings brief, Percival. I have no patience for lengthy tales of woe today. The cold makes me irritable, and I wish to return to my chambers where there is at least adequate warmth." Lord Thornwood bowed deeply, relief evident in his posture, and turned to signal the guards stationed at the great doors. The heavy wooden portals, reinforced with iron bands and studs, swung open with a groan that echoed through the hall. A blast of frigid air swept in, causing the torches mounted in their iron brackets along the walls to flicker and dance. The rushes on the floor stirred, releasing fresh waves of herbal scent as the first petitioners entered, stamping snow from their boots and drawing their thin cloaks more tightly around themselves. They came in a steady stream, a cross-section of medieval English society presenting themselves before their prince. First came a merchant in a coat of rough brown wool, complaining about bandits on the northern road who had made 3 attempts on his goods in as many weeks. Edmund listened with barely concealed impatience, his fingers tapping an irregular rhythm on the arm of his throne, and dispatched the matter with a curt order for the captain of the guard to increase patrols. Next came an elderly farmer whose land dispute with his neighbor had festered for 2 generations. Edmund cut through the man's rambling explanation with sharp questions, rendered a judgment that satisfied neither party completely, and moved on before the farmer could voice his protest. The morning wore on in this fashion, a parade of humanity bringing their troubles to lay at the feet of power. Edmund's responses grew shorter, his tone more clipped, his expression increasingly one of barely suppressed contempt for the concerns that seemed so trivial to him. He slouched in his throne, one leg thrown carelessly over the armrest, his posture suggesting that he found the entire proceeding beneath his dignity. It was approaching midday, when the weak winter sun had climbed to its highest point and still provided little warmth, that the guards ushered in a figure that immediately drew Edmund's attention, though not for any noble reason. The woman who entered the great hall moved with obvious difficulty, her breathing labored from the effort of climbing the many steps to the castle entrance. She was substantially overweight, her body wrapped in layers of threadbare clothing that did little to hide her considerable size. Her dress was of coarse gray wool, patched in numerous places, worn over a chemise that had once been white but was now a dingy cream color. A cloak of brown homespun, thin and inadequate for the winter weather, hung from her shoulders. Her face was round and flushed from exertion, framed by dark hair streaked with gray that escaped from beneath a simple linen coif. What struck observers most about her appearance, however, was not merely her size, but the obvious signs of hardship etched into every aspect of her being. Her hands, which clutched a small bundle wrapped in cloth, were red and chapped from cold and hard labor, the knuckles swollen and the fingers bent in ways that spoke of arthritis setting in prematurely. Her boots, visible beneath the hem of her dress, were worn through in places and had been inexpertly mended with twine. Despite her difficulties, there was something in her bearing, a straight back and lifted chin, that suggested a woman who retained her dignity even in the face of obvious poverty and physical struggle. As she made her way down the length of the great hall toward the throne, the sound of her labored breathing filled the space. Several of the nobles and servants gathered along the walls exchanged glances, some pitying, others merely curious about what business such a woman could have with the prince. Edmund sat up slightly in his throne, his eyes narrowing as he watched her approach, a slight smirk beginning to form at the corners of his mouth. "Well, well," Edmund said loudly as the woman finally reached the base of the dais, his voice carrying clearly through the hall and causing several people to look up sharply. "What have we here? Come to petition the prince, have you? I must say you've certainly brought enough of yourself to the audience." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through some of the assembled courtiers, though many looked away, embarrassed by their prince's crude remark. Lord Thornwood's expression tightened, and he opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, knowing from experience that correcting Edmund in public would only make matters worse. The woman's face flushed deeper, whether from the exertion of her journey, the cold, or the shame of being mocked. It was impossible to say, but she did not lower her eyes or retreat. Instead, she looked directly at Edmund with a gaze that held surprising steadiness, and when she spoke, her voice was clear despite her breathlessness. "Your Highness, I am Beatrice Holloway, widow of the blacksmith John Holloway of Millbrook Village. I have come to seek employment in the castle kitchens or laundry, Any honest work that would allow me to feed my daughter and keep a roof over our heads through this bitter winter." Her words were simple and direct, spoken with the careful pronunciation of someone who had rehearsed what she would say, who understood that she would have only one chance to make her case. The cloth bundle she carried, it could now be seen, contained what were likely references or examples of her work, the tools of a woman desperate to prove her worth. Edmund's smirk widened into a grin that held no warmth, only cruel amusement. He leaned forward in his throne, his elbows resting on his knees, studying Beatrice as one might examine a curiosity at a fair. "Employment in my kitchens? You cannot be serious, woman. Look at yourself. How much of my food would actually make it to the table? And how much would you consume along the way? I imagine keeping you fed would cost more than hiring 3 normal workers." The laughter that followed was louder this time, encouraged by the prince's obvious enjoyment of his own wit. Several young nobles near the front of the hall joined in with particular enthusiasm, competing with each other to show their allegiance to Edmund's humor. One called out, "She'd eat the profits, Your Highness." Another added, "Better check if she's already sampled the winter stores on her way in." Beatrice's hands tightened on her bundle, her knuckles whitening with the force of her grip, but she did not flee or break down in tears as Edmund clearly expected. Instead, she drew a deep breath and spoke again, her voice steady despite the obvious hurt in her eyes. "Your Highness, I am a hard worker. I have strong arms and can carry heavy loads. I know my way around a kitchen, having helped my mother run an inn before I married. I ask only for fair wages and the chance to prove my worth. My husband died in your service, working the forge to make weapons for your guard. Surely that counts for something." Edmund's amusement faded slightly, replaced by irritation that this woman dared to continue speaking, dared to reference obligations he might have to her family. He stood abruptly from his throne, his considerable height making him tower over the dais, and his expression hardened into something cold and dismissive. "Your husband chose his profession, and if he died at the forge, that was the risk he accepted. I owe you nothing, woman. As for employment, I'll not have someone of your appearance waddling about my castle, frightening the horses and blocking the corridors. You can barely make it up the steps without wheezing like a bellows. How do you expect to perform a day's work?" He descended the steps of the dais with swift, angry strides, his boots striking the stone floor with sharp reports that seemed to punctuate his words. He circled Beatrice slowly, deliberately, making a show of examining her from all angles while she stood frozen in place, her face now pale except for 2 bright spots of color high on her cheeks. "Furthermore," Edmund continued, warming to his theme now, playing to his audience of sycophantic nobles who hung on his every word, "I question what kind of woman lets herself fall into such a state. It speaks of a lack of discipline, of self-control. These are not qualities I value in my servants. My household must reflect the dignity and standards of this castle, and you, Mistress Holloway, do not meet those standards." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Even those who had laughed earlier now found themselves unable to meet Beatrice's eyes or Edmund's. Lord Thornwood had gone quite pale and was staring fixedly at the floor, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out along his neck. The servants along the walls had frozen in place, their usual bustling activity stilled by the cruelty of the scene unfolding before them. Beatrice stood perfectly still for a long moment, and those watching could see her chest rise and fall with careful, controlled breaths. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried in the silence of the hall like the tolling of a bell. "I see. Then I have wasted your time and mine, Your Highness. I will take my leave." She turned slowly with great dignity despite her physical difficulty, and began the long walk back toward the great doors. Each step seemed to cost her, not just physically, but emotionally, as though she was carrying the weight of Edmund's mockery with every movement. The bundle in her hands hung forgotten now, its contents whatever hopes she had brought with her to this place, all crushed beneath the boot of casual cruelty. Edmund watched her go with satisfaction, believing he had won something in this exchange, that he had asserted his authority and entertained his court. He returned to his throne and settled back into it with the air of a man well pleased with himself. "Next petitioner," he called out dismissively, waving his hand as though to clear away the memory of Beatrice Holloway along with the woman herself. But as the heavy doors closed behind Beatrice's departing figure, cutting off the blast of cold air and muffling the sounds of the bailey beyond, something shifted in the atmosphere of the great hall. It was nothing that could be easily defined. No supernatural occurrence or dramatic moment, merely a sense that something had been set in motion, that actions had consequences that reached farther than Edmund imagined in his comfortable cruelty. The winter afternoon dragged on with leaden slowness after Beatrice Holloway's departure from the Great Hall. Edmund continued to receive petitioners, though his mood had soured considerably, and he dispatched each case with even less patience than before. By the time Lord Thornwood finally announced that the last supplicant had been heard, the weak winter sun was already descending toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale orange that promised another frigid night. Edmund rose from his throne with visible relief, stretching his powerful frame and rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness that came from sitting for hours in the cold hall. He strode toward his private chambers without a word to anyone, his heavy boots echoing through the corridors of stone as servants pressed themselves against the walls to let him pass. His rooms were located in the eastern tower of the castle, a suite of chambers that afforded him both privacy and a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. The prince's bedchamber was warm, heated by a large fireplace where logs crackled and popped, sending dancing shadows across walls hung with rich tapestries depicting hunting scenes and battles from ages past. A massive bed dominated one wall, its oak frame carved with ravens and wolves, piled high with furs and woolen blankets dyed in deep reds and blues. Heavy curtains of burgundy velvet could be drawn around it for added warmth and privacy. A table near the fire held a flagon of wine and a plate of cold meats and bread, left by servants who knew their master's preferences. Edmund poured himself a generous cup of wine, the rich red liquid catching the firelight as he raised it to his lips. He moved to the window, pulling aside the thick curtain to look out over his domain. From this height, he could see the castle bailey below, where torches were being lit against the gathering darkness. Beyond the walls stretched the village of Ravenshold, a collection of timber and stone buildings clustered around the road that led north toward Scotland. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, carrying the scent of cooking fires and the warmth of family hearths. In the distance, fields lay dormant under their blanket of snow, waiting for spring's eventual arrival. As Edmund gazed out at this scene, his thoughts drifted back unbidden to the woman he had humiliated earlier. He felt no remorse for his actions. That was not in his nature, but something about the encounter lingered in his mind like a persistent itch he could not scratch. Perhaps it was the way she had looked at him with those steady eyes, not with the fear or deference he was accustomed to, but with something else, something that almost resembled pity. The thought irritated him, and he drank more deeply from his cup, trying to wash away the uncomfortable feeling. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called out sharply, not turning from the window. The door opened to admit Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, Edmund's closest friend and companion since childhood. Geoffrey was nearly the same age as Edmund, with auburn hair that fell in loose curls around a face marked by a crooked nose, broken in a tournament years ago and never properly set. He was shorter than Edmund but powerfully built, with the thick arms and broad chest of a man who spent his days training with weapons. He wore a tunic of dark green leather over a shirt of fine linen, with tall boots of black leather that reached to his knees. A sword hung at his hip, as it always did, for Geoffrey was captain of Edmund's personal guard. "Your Highness," Geoffrey said, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of long friendship. "You've been hiding away up here for hours. The evening meal will be served soon in the hall. Will you be joining us, or shall I have food sent up?" Edmund turned from the window, gesturing for Geoffrey to help himself to the wine. "I'll come down shortly. I've had enough of my own company for one day, though I'm not certain the company below will be much improvement." Geoffrey poured wine into a second cup and settled into one of the chairs near the fire, stretching his legs toward the warmth. "I heard about the audience today. They're talking about it in the barracks, how you sent that fat woman away in tears." "She didn't cry," Edmund corrected, moving to take the chair opposite his friend. "That's what made it so strange. She just stood there and took it, then walked out with her head high as though she were a queen and not a poverty-stricken widow begging for scraps." Geoffrey laughed, the sound hearty and uncomplicated. "Well, she can't have expected you to actually give her work. Can you imagine her trying to haul water or turn a spit? She'd probably collapse after an hour." Edmund nodded, but the uncomfortable feeling persisted. He changed the subject, asking Geoffrey about the training of new recruits and the state of the armory, topics that were safer and required less thought. They talked for some time, finishing the flagon of wine and opening another, their conversation ranging from military matters to gossip about various nobles at court, to plans for a hunting expedition once the worst of the winter had passed. Eventually, as the bells in the castle chapel tolled the hour for evening prayers, they made their way down to the great hall for the meal. The space had been transformed since the afternoon's petitions. Long trestle tables had been set up, their surfaces covered with white linen cloths and laden with food. Trenchers of bread served as plates, piled high with roasted meats, root vegetables swimming in butter and herbs, and thick stews that steamed in the cool air. Servants moved among the tables, pouring ale and wine, while musicians in the gallery above played lutes and pipes, filling the hall with music that was meant to be festive, but somehow fell flat in the cold atmosphere. Edmund took his place at the high table on the dais, with Geoffrey to his right and Lord Thornwood to his left. Other nobles and knights filled the remaining seats, while lower-ranking members of the household sat at the tables below. The meal proceeded with all the usual ceremony, though Edmund noticed that the conversation seemed more subdued than usual, as though his earlier cruelty had cast a pall over the evening's festivities. Midway through the meal, as servants were clearing away the remains of the main course and bringing out dishes of preserved fruits and honeyed cakes, a commotion arose near the great doors. Voices were raised in argument, and Edmund looked up with annoyance, ready to reprimand whoever was disturbing his meal. The doors burst open, and a man stumbled in, supported on either side by guards who were half carrying him. The man was young, perhaps 20 years of age, with a face that might have been handsome, but was now gray with pain and exhaustion. His clothes were those of a common laborer, rough wool and leather, but they were soaked through with melting snow, and something darker that Edmund recognized with a start as blood. A makeshift bandage, once white but now crimson, was wrapped around his left arm, and he moved with the careful gait of someone trying not to jar injured ribs. "Your Highness," gasped the man, his voice weak but urgent, "I beg your pardon for the intrusion, but I bring grave news from the northern road. We were attacked, Your Highness. Bandits, a large group of them, more organized than any we've encountered before. They have weapons, real weapons, not just clubs and knives, swords and axes. Some even have mail shirts. They're not just thieves anymore, they're an army." The hall had gone completely silent, all eyes fixed on the injured man and then on Edmund, waiting to see how their prince would respond. Edmund rose slowly from his chair, his expression hardening into something more focused and alert than it had been all day. This was the kind of problem he understood, one that could be solved with steel and strategy rather than the messy complexities of dealing with the suffering of common people. "How many?" Edmund demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "At least 40, Your Highness, maybe more. They hit our caravan just before dusk, 3 miles north of Millbrook village. We were carrying supplies from the northern farms, winter stores bound for the castle. They took everything, killed 5 men, and left the rest of us for dead in the snow. I only survived because I played dead until they left, then crawled to a farmhouse. The farmer's son brought me here on his cart." Edmund's mind was already working through the implications. A band of 40 armed men was not a simple group of thieves. It was a military force, organized and equipped well enough to pose a real threat. If they had attacked this close to Ravenshold, they were either growing bolder or preparing for something larger. Either way, they needed to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. "Geoffrey," Edmund said sharply, turning to his captain, "rouse the guard. I want 50 men ready to ride at first light. We'll track these bastards to their hole and burn them out." Geoffrey was already on his feet, his hand on his sword hilt, his face alight with the prospect of action. "It will be done, Your Highness. Though perhaps we should send scouts ahead tonight, see if we can locate their camp before they scatter." Edmund nodded approvingly. "A sound thought. Send your best trackers, men who know how to move quietly in the dark. I want information by dawn, where they are, how many, what defenses they've set up. We'll plan our attack based on what they find." Lord Thornwood had risen as well, though his expression was troubled rather than excited. "Your Highness, might I suggest we also send word to Lord Pemberton at Greystone Keep? His lands border the northern road as well, and he has men he could contribute to the effort. A larger force would ensure victory with fewer casualties." "And give him a share of the glory?" Edmund scoffed. "No, Thornwood, this is our territory, our responsibility, and our victory. I'll not have Pemberton claiming he saved us from bandits." The men of Ravenshold are more than capable of handling a rabble of thieves, no matter how well armed they think they are. He turned back to the injured messenger, who was swaying slightly on his feet, clearly near the end of his strength. "You've done well to bring us this warning. See that he's taken to the infirmary," Edmund ordered the guards. "Have the healers tend his wounds and give him a warm bed. When he's recovered, there will be a reward for his service." As the guards helped the messenger away, Edmund felt the familiar rush of anticipation that always preceded action. This was what he was made for, not sitting in judgment over petty disputes or deciding whether to give charity to undeserving beggars. This was leadership, the kind that involved strategy and courage and the very real possibility of danger. He felt more alive in this moment than he had in months. The remainder of the evening was spent in planning. Maps were brought out and spread across the high table, showing the roads and villages and forests of the Northern Territory. Geoffrey and the other military men offered suggestions and debated tactics while Edmund listened and made decisions with swift confidence. Servants were sent running with orders. Wake the blacksmith to ensure all weapons were sharp and armor was in good repair. Prepare provisions for a multi-day campaign. Alert the stable master to have horses ready before dawn. Bring extra blankets and cold weather gear from the stores. The great hall became a hive of organized activity, the earlier lethargy burned away by the urgency of impending conflict. Edmund stood at the center of it all, directing and commanding, and felt himself settling into a role that fit him far better than the throne of judgment ever had. He was a warrior prince, and war, even on this small scale, was where he belonged. It was nearly midnight when he finally returned to his chambers, his mind still racing with plans and possibilities. Sleep would not come easily tonight, he knew, but that was fine. He had never needed much rest before a fight. The fire in his room had burned down to embers, and he stirred it back to life before pouring himself another cup of wine and returning to the window. The castle below was quiet now, most inhabitants asleep in preparation for the early morning. But in the barracks, he could see lights still burning as Geoffrey and his men prepared. In the armory, shadows moved behind windows as weapons were gathered and checked. The entire castle was preparing for war, small though it might be, and Edmund felt satisfaction settle over him like a comfortable cloak. Tomorrow, he would ride out at the head of his men and deal with this threat in the only way such threats could be dealt with, through strength and steel. The bandits would learn that attacking Ravenshold's territory came with a price, and that price would be paid in blood. It was simple, straightforward, and infinitely preferable to the complicated moral questions raised by women like Beatrice Holloway, who asked for help Edmund did not want to give and stirred feelings he preferred not to examine. He finished his wine and climbed into bed, pulling the furs around himself against the cold. As he drifted toward sleep, his last conscious thought was of the battle to come, of victory and glory, and the clean simplicity of violence. He did not think of Beatrice Holloway or her steady, pitying eyes. He did not think of the words she had spoken about her husband dying in his service. He pushed those thoughts away into the darkness where they belonged, and dreamed instead of triumph. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute when Edmund woke to the sound of horns calling the garrison to arms. He rose quickly, the cold air of his chamber biting at his skin as he threw off the heavy furs and moved to the basin where servants had left water for washing. The water had a thin skin of ice across its surface, which he broke with his fingers before splashing it on his face, the shock of cold driving away the last vestiges of sleep and sharpening his senses for what lay ahead. Dressing for battle was a ritual Edmund had performed countless times, and his hands moved with practiced efficiency. First came the padded gambeson, thick quilted fabric that would absorb the impact of blows and provide a layer of protection beneath the heavier armor. Over this went a shirt of mail, thousands of interlocking iron rings that whispered and clinked with every movement, the weight of it settling across his shoulders like a familiar burden. Leather straps secured the mail in place, and over it all went a surcoat of burgundy wool emblazoned with the raven of his house in black thread. His sword belt came next, supporting a blade that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, its pommel worn smooth by generations of hands. Finally, Edmund fastened a heavy cloak of wolf fur around his shoulders, both for warmth and for the psychological effect it would have on his enemies. He looked every inch the warrior prince as he descended the tower stairs, his boots ringing against stone, the sound echoing through corridors still mostly silent with sleep. But as he emerged into the bailey, he found it transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. 50 men stood assembled in rough formation, their breath creating clouds of mist in the frigid air. They wore a mixture of armor, those from wealthy families sporting mail similar to Edmund's own, while others made do with leather reinforced with metal studs or strips. All carried weapons, swords, axes, maces, and spears, their edges glinting in the light of torches that had been placed around the yard. Horses stamped and snorted, their warm breath steaming, as stable boys held their reins and checked girths and bridles one final time. Geoffrey strode forward to meet Edmund, his own armor covered by a green surcoat, his hand resting on his sword hilt in an unconscious gesture of readiness. "Your Highness, the men are assembled and provisioned. The scouts returned an hour ago with their report. The bandits have made camp in the old ruins of Blackthorn Abbey, about 8 miles north. They're using the remaining walls for shelter and have posted sentries, but they don't expect an attack. They think themselves safe." Edmund felt a grim smile tug at his lips. Blackthorn Abbey had been abandoned for nearly a century, ever since a fire had gutted most of its structures and the monks had relocated to a newer foundation closer to the coast. The ruins would provide some shelter from the elements but were far from defensible against a determined assault. The bandits had chosen poorly if they thought crumbling walls would protect them from the prince's justice. "Excellent work," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly across the bailey so that the assembled men could hear their commander's approval. "How many did the scouts count?" 43 men, give or take. They have campfires burning in the old chapter house and the remains of the church. Some were on watch, but most were sleeping. They have horses as well, about 30, kept in what used to be the stable yard. The scouts reported that the sentries were more concerned with staying warm than watching the approaches. Edmund nodded, his tactical mind already working through the possibilities. With 50 men against 43, they had numerical advantage, though not an overwhelming one. But they would have the element of surprise, and they would be attacking a force that was cold, likely still partially drunk from celebrating their successful raid, and unprepared for professional soldiers. The odds were strongly in their favor. "We'll approach from the east," Edmund decided, gesturing as though the terrain were laid out before them. "The old pilgrim road runs within half a mile of the abbey. We'll leave the horses there with a guard, approach on foot through the forest. Split into 3 groups. Geoffrey, you'll take 20 men and circle around to block the north road, their most likely escape route." "Sir William," he nodded to a grizzled knight who had fought in his father's wars, "you'll take 15 and position yourself to the west, cutting off that avenue. I'll lead the remaining force in a direct assault from the east at dawn. When they break and run, you'll be waiting." The plan was simple but effective, the kind that had been used successfully in countless small engagements throughout history. Sir William and Geoffrey both nodded their understanding, their expressions showing approval of the strategy. Around them, the assembled soldiers stirred with anticipation, hands checking weapons, adjusting straps, preparing themselves mentally for the violence to come. "Mount up," Edmund commanded, and the bailey erupted with activity as men swung themselves into saddles and gathered reins. The great gates were hauled open, their hinges protesting with shrieks of metal on metal that shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Edmund mounted his own destrier, a massive black stallion named Thunder that had carried him through 3 years of border skirmishes and tournaments. The horse sensed his master's mood and pranced eagerly, tossing his head and sending his mane flying. They rode out in a column of 2s, hooves striking the frozen ground with sounds like drumbeats, breath from horses and men alike, creating a fog that trailed behind them as they left the castle. The road north was treacherous in the darkness, covered with packed snow that hid patches of ice capable of bringing down a horse if the rider was not careful. But Edmund's men were experienced, and they navigated the hazards with the ease of familiarity, maintaining a steady pace that would bring them to their destination well before dawn. As they rode, Edmund found his thoughts drifting despite his attempts to focus on the coming battle. The rhythm of Thunder's gait, the cold air rushing past his face, the jingle of harness and mail, all of it faded into background noise as unwanted memories surfaced. He thought of his father, King Harold, who had died last summer after a short illness that had wasted his powerful frame to almost nothing in a matter of weeks. Edmund had been summoned to his bedside in those final days, and had sat through long hours listening to his father's labored breathing, watching life ebb away despite the best efforts of physicians and priests. In those final conversations, Harold had spoken to Edmund about duty and responsibility, about the weight that came with power, and the obligation to use it justly. A prince, his father had rasped, his once strong voice reduced to a whisper, is not elevated above his people so that he might look down upon them, but so that he might better see their needs and serve them more effectively. Power without compassion is tyranny, Edmund. Remember that when I am gone. Edmund had nodded and made the appropriate responses, but in truth he had not understood. He had seen power as something to be wielded, not shared. Compassion seemed like weakness, a luxury that rulers could not afford if they wished to maintain order and command respect. His father's softness, as Edmund saw it, had made people bold in their demands and disrespectful in their attitudes. Edmund was determined to rule differently, to be strong where his father had been weak, to be feared where his father had merely been loved. Yet the memory of those deathbed words troubled him now, rising up unbidden as thunder carried him through the frozen landscape. He thought of Beatrice Holloway standing before him in the great hall, her dignity maintained even as he stripped away her hope. He thought of the way she had mentioned her husband dying in his service, a debt Edmund had dismissed as irrelevant. He thought of her walking away with her head held high, carrying the weight of his cruelty with the same strength she carried her physical burdens. Edmund shook his head sharply, as if he could physically dislodge these unwelcome reflections. This was not the time for such thoughts. He was riding to battle, and battle required focus and clarity of purpose. There would be time enough for introspection later, if indeed such introspection was even necessary. He had made his decision regarding the woman, and he saw no reason to question it now. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, turning from black to deep purple, to a pale gray that promised another cold, clear day. They reached the old pilgrim road, just as the first rays of actual sunlight began to paint the tops of the trees in shades of gold and amber. Edmund called a halt and dismounted, his men following suit with the practiced silence of warriors who understood the importance of stealth. A dozen soldiers were left with the horses, men whose injuries or age made them less suited for the coming fight, but who could be trusted to guard their retreat. The remaining force split into its predetermined groups. Geoffrey led his 20 men off to the north, moving quickly through the forest with weapons muffled in cloth to prevent noise. Sir William took his 15 and headed west, disappearing among the trees with equal efficiency. Edmund gathered his remaining soldiers around him, 15 of his best fighters, men he had trained with and fought beside, men he knew he could rely on when the killing started. We move quietly until we're spotted, Edmund instructed in a low voice that nonetheless carried clearly to every man. Then we hit them hard and fast. Show no mercy to any man who raises a weapon against you, but if they surrender, accept it. I want prisoners to question about who's been supplying them and whether there are other bands operating in the region. Understood? A chorus of quiet affirmations answered him, and then they were moving, filtering through the forest like shadows as the light continued to grow around them. The ruins of Blackthorn Abbey appeared through the trees gradually, walls of gray stone rising from the snow-covered ground like the bones of some great beast long dead. The scouts' information had been accurate. Campfires still burned in the shelter of walls, and Edmund could see figures moving about, men stirring from sleep and beginning their morning routines with the casual confidence of those who believed themselves safe. Edmund positioned his men along the edge of the tree line, spacing them out so that when they charged, they would hit the bandit camp in a broad front that would maximize confusion and terror. He drew his sword slowly, carefully, the blade whispering against the scabbard with a sound like a serpent's hiss. Around him, his men did the same, preparing themselves for the violence that was now only moments away. The sun crept higher, its light now reaching down through the bare branches to touch the abbey ruins with fingers of gold. Edmund counted silently, giving Geoffrey and Sir William time to reach their positions. When he judged the moment right, he raised his sword high above his head, holding it there for 3 long heartbeats, and then brought it down in a slashing motion that was the signal to attack. The men of Ravenshold erupted from the forest with a roar that shattered the morning quiet like glass. They charged across the open ground toward the abbey ruins, their battle cry of "Ravenshold! Ravenshold!" echoing off the stone walls and creating confusion about their actual numbers. The effect on the bandit camp was immediate and devastating. Men scrambled for weapons, some still half-dressed, others frozen in shock at the sudden appearance of armored soldiers where none had been moments before. Edmund was in the lead, Thunder's earlier spirit now flowing through his own veins, As he covered the ground in great strides, his sword held ready. He reached the first bandit before the man had even managed to draw his own weapon, and Edmund's blade took him in the shoulder with a blow that sent him spinning to the ground. Around him, his men crashed into the disorganized bandits like a wave breaking against a shore, and the air filled with the sounds of combat. Steel on steel, screams of pain and rage, the thud of bodies hitting frozen earth. The bandits fought back with the desperation of men who knew they faced death or capture, but they were scattered and unprepared, caught between Edmund's force driving in from the east and Geoffrey's men now appearing from the north. Some tried to flee toward the west, only to find Sir William's soldiers blocking that route as well. Within minutes, the organized resistance had collapsed into a series of individual struggles as bandits tried to fight their way clear or sought corners where they might make a stand. Edmund found himself facing 3 men who had managed to group together, backing toward one of the more intact walls of the abbey. They were all armed with swords that, as the wounded messenger had reported, were of good quality, far better than common thieves should have possessed. Edmund studied them for a moment, noting the way they held their weapons, the way they moved. These were not just bandits. They had military training. "Who supplied your weapons?" Edmund demanded, his sword point steady as he advanced slowly. "Who's been arming you?" The center man, older than the others with a scar that ran from his forehead to his chin, spat on the ground. "Go to hell, princeling. We'll tell you nothing." Edmund's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll die for nothing." He attacked with the speed and skill that had made him champion in 3 tournaments, his blade moving in a pattern that forced the bandits to respond defensively. The man on the right made the mistake of overextending his parry, and Edmund's sword found the gap in his guard, sliding past his defense to open his throat. The bandit fell choking. Blood sprang across the snow in a crimson fan that steamed in the cold air. The remaining 2 pressed their attack with renewed fury, but Edmund gave ground deliberately, drawing them away from the wall and into the open where Geoffrey, having finished with his own opponents, could come at them from the side. It was over quickly after that, both men disarmed and forced to their knees, their weapons clattering against stone as they were stripped away. All around the ruins, similar scenes were playing out as the last resistance crumbled. Some bandits threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Others fought until they were cut down, and a handful managed to slip away into the forest, though Edmund doubted they would survive long in the winter cold without supplies or horses. Within less than an hour of the initial attack, the battle was over. Edmund stood in the center of what had been the abbey's nave, now open to the sky where the roof had collapsed decades ago. Bodies lay scattered across the snow-covered ground, most wearing the rough clothes of bandits, though 3 of his own men had fallen as well, a price he had expected to pay but one that still left a bitter taste. The surviving bandits, numbering about 15, were being gathered together and bound with rope. Geoffrey approached, wiping blood from his sword with a rag before sheathing it. "A good morning's work, Your Highness. We've captured their supplies as well, including what they stole from the caravan yesterday. And you need to see this." He led Edmund to what had been the abbot's quarters, where several of his men stood guard over a cache of weapons and armor that had been hidden beneath moldy straw and rotting sacks. Edmund knelt to examine them more closely, his expression growing darker with each piece he inspected. Swords of good steel, their blades marked with the stamp of a reputable smith, hauberks of mail, well-maintained and oiled against rust. Even several sets of plate armor for arms and legs, expensive pieces that no bandit band could afford to purchase. "Someone has been equipping them," Geoffrey said quietly, voicing what Edmund was already thinking. "This is not random theft. This is organized, supplied, planned. These men were being prepared for something more than highway robbery." Edmund stood, his mind racing through the implications. Who would benefit from arming bandits in his territory? Who had the resources and the motive to create this kind of chaos? The list of possibilities was disturbingly long. Rival nobles who coveted his lands, merchants who wanted to destabilize the region to drive down property values before buying, even foreign powers who might see advantage in weakening England's northern defenses. Without more information, it was impossible to know. "Question the prisoners," Edmund ordered. "Use whatever means necessary. I want to know who's behind this, where the weapons came from, whether there are other bands being supplied in the same way, and send riders to the neighboring lords, warn them of what we've found. If someone is trying to foment rebellion or invasion, they need to be prepared." The sun had fully risen now, climbing into a sky that was achingly blue and empty of clouds. Edmund walked among the ruins, looking at the aftermath of the battle, at the bodies being gathered for burial or burning, at his own wounded men being tended by their companions. He should have felt satisfaction at this victory, pride in how smoothly the operation had been executed, but instead he felt only a growing unease that had nothing to do with the mystery of the weapons or the threat of larger conspiracies. He thought again of his father's dying words, of duty and responsibility and the proper use of power. He thought of Beatrice Holloway and her simple request for honest work, a request he had denied with mockery while sitting in warmth and safety. He thought of her husband, who had died making weapons perhaps not so different from the ones these bandits had carried, serving a prince who would not lift a finger to help his widow when she most needed it. The unease crystallized into something sharper, something that might have been the first stirring of shame, though Edmund was not yet ready to give it that name. He turned away from the ruins and began the walk back to where the horses waited, his men falling in around him, some singing victory songs, while others maintained the silence of those who had seen death up close and found nothing glorious in it. The ride back to Ravenshold Castle seemed longer than the ride out had been, though it covered the same distance. Edmund was quiet, lost in thoughts that grew more uncomfortable with each mile. By the time the castle walls came into view, he had made a decision, though he could not have said exactly what had prompted it or what he hoped to accomplish. He knew only that something needed to change, that the path he had been walking led nowhere he truly wanted to go. As they rode through the gates to the cheers of those who had remained behind, Edmund was already planning his next move, one that had nothing to do with bandits or battles or the simple application of force to solve problems. This would require something far more difficult, something that might cost him more than any physical wound ever could, the courage to admit he had been wrong. The great hall of Ravenshold Castle was filled with celebration that evening, long tables groaning under the weight of food and drink as the victorious soldiers recounted their exploits to those who had remained behind. Torches blazed in their brackets, casting dancing light across faces flushed with ale and triumph. Musicians played with renewed vigor, their melodies punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional crash of a cup slammed down in emphasis of some particularly dramatic story. The air was thick with the smells of roasted meat, spilled wine, wood smoke, and the distinctive scent of many bodies crowded together in a warm space. Edmund sat at the high table, accepting congratulations from Lord Thornwood and other nobles with polite nods and appropriate responses, but his heart was not in the festivities. He drank sparingly, pushing food around his trencher without much appetite, his mind occupied with thoughts that had nothing to do with the day's victory. Geoffrey noticed his friend's distraction and leaned close, speaking low enough that others could not overhear. "You've been brooding since we left the Abbey," Geoffrey observed, his words slightly slurred from the ale he had consumed. "We won, Edmund, decisively. The bandits are either dead or captured, the threat is ended, and we've uncovered evidence of a larger plot that we can now investigate. This should be a night of triumph, yet you sit there looking like you're attending a funeral rather than a feast." Edmund turned to face his friend, noting the genuine concern in Geoffrey's eyes beneath the glaze of intoxication. "Tell me something honestly, Geoffrey. Do you remember the woman who came seeking work yesterday? The one I sent away?" Geoffrey's expression grew cautious, as though he sensed dangerous ground ahead. "The fat widow? What about her? Do you think I was right to refuse her? To mock her as I did?" The question clearly caught Geoffrey off guard. He blinked several times, trying to focus through the ale and process what his prince was asking. Well, Your Highness, she was not suitable for service in the castle. Anyone could see that. You were within your rights to decline her petition." "That's not what I asked," Edmund pressed. "I asked if I was right, if what I did was just." Geoffrey shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around as if hoping someone might rescue him from this conversation. When no rescue appeared forthcoming, he sighed and spoke carefully. "You were cruel, Edmund. More cruel than necessary. We all knew it, even those who laughed along with your jests. But you're the prince. Who are we to question your judgments?" The answer was not what Edmund had hoped to hear, yet it was exactly what he had expected. He nodded slowly, finishing the wine in his cup and setting it down with deliberate precision. "I need to know where she lives. The woman, Beatrice Holloway. She said she was from Millbrook Village. Do you know it?" "Everyone knows Millbrook," Geoffrey replied, his brow furrowing in confusion. It's 3 miles south along the river road, a farming village of maybe 40 families. But why do you want to know? Surely you're not thinking of... Edmund, what are you planning? Edmund stood abruptly, the scrape of his chair against stone causing several nearby conversations to pause as heads turned toward the high table. I'm retiring for the evening, he announced to the hall at large. Continue the celebration without me. You've all earned it. He strode from the hall before anyone could question him further, his long cloak billowing behind him as he took the stairs to his chambers 2 at a time. Once inside, he moved to his writing desk, a heavy piece of carved oak that held parchment, ink, quills, and sealing wax. He lit several candles to supplement the firelight and sat down to write, the quill scratching across the parchment as he composed his thoughts into words. The letter took several attempts before he was satisfied with it. He had never been particularly skilled at written expression, preferring the direct communication of spoken commands, but this required care and precision. When he finally finished, he read it over one last time, then sealed it with wax and his signet ring, pressing the raven of his house into the soft wax and watching it harden. Edmund did not sleep well that night. He lay in his great bed surrounded by furs and blankets, warm and comfortable in every physical sense, yet his mind would not rest. He kept seeing Beatrice Holloway's face, the flush of humiliation on her cheeks, the way her hands had tightened on her bundle of hopes. He kept hearing his father's voice speaking of duty and compassion, words he had dismissed as the weakness of a dying man, but which now echoed in his consciousness with uncomfortable persistence. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, Edmund rose and dressed in simple traveling clothes, rather than the fine garments of a prince. He chose a tunic of plain brown wool, well made but unremarkable, over which he wore a leather jerkin and a cloak of dark gray that would not stand out among common folk. He belted on his sword, for no man traveled the roads unarmed even in peaceful times, but he left behind the ornate blade he usually carried, and instead took a simpler weapon from the armory. He made his way to the stables as the castle was just beginning to wake, servants starting their daily routines and guards changing shifts. The stable master, a grizzled man named Thomas who had served Edmund's father for 30 years, looked up in surprise as the prince entered. "Your Highness, I was not told you planned to ride out this morning. Shall I saddle Thunder for you?" "No," Edmund replied, surprising them both with his answer. "I'll take Ash, the gray gelding, and I'll saddle him myself. I require no escort today, Thomas. This is a private matter." Thomas's bushy eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline, but he knew better than to question his prince's decisions. He simply pointed toward the stall where Ash stood munching hay, then returned to his own work with pointed discretion. Edmund saddled the horse with practiced efficiency, checking the girth and bridle carefully before leading the animal out into the bailey. The ride to Millbrook village took less than an hour at an easy pace. The river road was well maintained, cleared of snow by travelers and farmers bringing goods to market, and Ash moved with the steady gait of a horse accustomed to long journeys. Edmund had ridden this road countless times, usually at the head of a column of soldiers or surrounded by hunting parties, but never alone, and never with such uncertainty about his purpose. Millbrook village appeared gradually as the road curved to follow the river's bend. It was a typical English farming settlement of the period, a collection of perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a central green. Most were timber-framed houses with thatched roofs, their walls filled with wattle and daub that had been whitewashed, but was now stained gray and brown by weather and time. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the scent of cooking fires. A stone church with a modest bell tower dominated one side of the green, its graveyard surrounded by a low wall. A mill stood beside the river, its wheel turning steadily as it ground grain into flour. Despite the early hour, the village was already busy with activity. Women carried water from the communal well, their conversations creating a constant murmur of sound. Children played in the snow, their laughter sharp in the cold air. Men worked in yards, chopping wood or tending to animals in small pens beside their homes. A few looked up as Edmund rode in, their faces showing curiosity but no recognition. In his simple clothes and without the symbols of his rank, he was just another traveler, perhaps a merchant or a soldier on leave. Edmund reined in Ash near the well, where an elderly woman was filling wooden buckets. She looked up at him with eyes clouded by cataracts, but still sharp with intelligence. her face a roadmap of wrinkles that spoke of 70 winters or more. She wore layers of threadbare clothing against the cold, topped with a shawl that might once have been blue, but had faded to a color somewhere between gray and nothing at all. "Good morning, grandmother," Edmund said, using the respectful term common when addressing elderly women. "I'm looking for the home of Beatrice Holloway. Can you direct me?" The old woman's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "And what would you be wanting with Beatrice, young man? If you're a creditor come to squeeze blood from stones, you'll find no satisfaction here. The woman has nothing left to give." "I'm not a creditor," Edmund assured her, though he did not elaborate on his actual purpose. "I have business with her, but it's of a helpful nature, I promise you. Please just point me to her home." The old woman studied him for a long moment, her clouded eyes somehow seeming to see more than they should. Finally, she raised one gnarled hand and pointed toward the far edge of the village. "The cottage with the red door, last one before the fields. But you mind your manners with her, young man. Beatrice Holloway is a good woman who's known more than her share of suffering. She deserves kindness, not more trouble." Edmund thanked her and guided Ash in the direction indicated, feeling the weight of the old woman's gaze on his back as he rode away. The cottage with the red door was smaller than most of the others in the village, set slightly apart as though it existed on the boundary between civilization and the wild lands beyond. It was old, the timber frame showing signs of age and weather damage, though someone had made efforts to maintain it. The thatch roof had been recently repaired in places, new straw visible against the old. A small pen beside the house held 2 chickens and a goat that watched Edmund's approach with mild interest. He dismounted and tied Ash to a post near the door, then stood for a moment gathering his courage. This was harder than facing bandits, harder than any battle he had fought. In combat, he knew the rules, understood the objectives, could measure success or failure in clear terms. This was different, uncertain, requiring a kind of bravery he was not sure he possessed. Before he could knock, the red door opened, and a young woman appeared in the doorway. She was perhaps 16 or 17 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid and eyes that were startlingly blue against her pale skin. She wore a dress of brown wool, patched but clean, and regarded Edmund with a mixture of curiosity and caution. There was something familiar in the shape of her face, the line of her jaw, and Edmund realized this must be Beatrice's daughter. "Can I help you, sir?" the girl asked, her voice soft but steady. "I'm looking for Beatrice Holloway," Edmund said. "Is she at home?" The girl's expression became more guarded, protective. "My mother is not well. She's been abed since yesterday. If you have business with her, perhaps you could return another time." Edmund felt his stomach tighten with concern. "Not well? What's wrong? Has she seen a physician?" "Physicians cost money we don't have," the girl replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "It's just a cold, she says, though she's been coughing something fierce. She'll recover. She always does. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back to tending her." She began to close the door, but Edmund put his hand against it, stopping her. "Please, I need to speak with her. It's important. I've come from the castle." The girl's eyes widened with sudden fear, and her face went pale. "From the castle? Has something happened? Is this about what happened yesterday?" Mother came home in tears, though she wouldn't say why. "Did she do something wrong? Are we in trouble?" Edmund felt his chest constrict with guilt at the fear in this young woman's eyes, fear that he had caused. No trouble. Please, I just need to speak with her. I have something to give her." The girl hesitated, clearly torn between protecting her mother and the ingrained deference to authority that came from growing up in a feudal society. Finally, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "She's in the back room, but please, sir, don't upset her. She's been through enough." Edmund entered the cottage, ducking his head to clear the low doorway. The interior was dim, lit only by a small fire burning in a central hearth, and what little winter sunlight made it through the single window with its covering of oiled parchment. The main room was small, perhaps 15 feet on a side, with a dirt floor covered in straw. Simple furnishings filled the space, a rough table with 2 stools, a chest against one wall, hooks on the walls holding cooking implements and clothing. Despite the poverty evident in every aspect of the dwelling, it was clean and as well maintained as limited resources would allow. The girl led him to a doorway covered with a curtain of faded fabric. "Mother, there's a man here from the castle. He says he needs to speak with you." A voice came from beyond the curtain, weakened by illness but still recognizable as Beatrice's, from the castle? Oh God, what now? Tell him I'll leave the village if that's what he wants. Tell him I meant no offense. Edmund felt each word like a physical blow, the evidence of the damage his cruelty had caused. He pushed past the curtain before the daughter could respond and found himself in a tiny room barely large enough for the narrow bed that dominated it. Beatrice lay beneath threadbare blankets, her face flushed with fever, her eyes sunken and dark-circled. She looked worse than she had in the great hall, the illness stripping away what little vitality poverty had left her. When she saw Edmund, she tried to struggle upright, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to fear. "Your Highness," she gasped, then dissolved into a fit of coughing that shook her entire body. Her daughter rushed forward with a cup of water, helping her mother drink and easing her back against the thin pillow. Edmund stood frozen, struck by the reality of what he was seeing. This woman, whom he had mocked and dismissed, lived in conditions he would not have tolerated for his horses. She was ill, possibly seriously so, and had no access to medicine or proper care. Her daughter, barely more than a child, was trying to manage a household and care for a sick mother with resources that were clearly inadequate. And this was partly his fault, because he had denied her the work that might have made the difference between bare survival and something approaching security. "Please," Edmund said, his voice rough with emotion he was not accustomed to showing. "Please don't try to get up. I need to." He found himself unable to finish the sentence, the words he had rehearsed in his mind suddenly inadequate to the moment. He pulled the sealed letter from inside his jerkin, along with a small leather purse heavy with coins. He set them both on the small table beside the bed, then stepped back. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "What I said to you yesterday, how I treated you, it was wrong. You came asking for honest work, and I responded with cruelty. Your husband served my house faithfully, and I dishonored his memory by refusing to help his widow. I cannot undo what I said, but I can try to make amends." Beatrice stared at him, her fever-bright eyes wide with disbelief. Her daughter had moved to stand beside the bed, one hand protectively on her mother's shoulder, looking between Edmund and Beatrice with an expression of complete confusion. "The letter is an appointment to a position in the castle household," Edmund continued, speaking quickly now, as though he feared he might lose his courage if he paused. "Not the kitchens or laundry. I'm creating a new position, keeper of the household accounts. You'll be responsible for tracking expenses, managing the household budget, ensuring that supplies are ordered appropriately, and that servants are paid fairly. It's work that can be done sitting down, that requires intelligence and literacy rather than physical strength. The pay is generous, enough to support you and your daughter comfortably. There are quarters in the castle that come with the position, warm and dry, with access to the castle physician when needed." He gestured to the purse. "That contains enough silver to pay for a doctor now, to buy medicine, to cover your expenses until you're well enough to take up the position. It's not charity, Mistress Holloway. It's payment that was owed to you and that I wrongly withheld. Will you accept it?" The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire in the other room and Beatrice's labored breathing. She looked at the letter and the purse, then at her daughter, then finally at Edmund. Her eyes were wet with tears that had nothing to do with fever. "Why?" she whispered. "After yesterday, why would you do this?" Edmund met her gaze, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he answered a question with complete honesty, without calculation or consideration of how it would make him appear. "Because I was reminded that being a prince means more than wearing a crown and giving orders. It means serving those who depend on me, even when, especially when, they cannot demand it. My father understood that. I'm beginning to." The weeks that followed Edmund's visit to Millbrook brought changes to Ravenshold Castle that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Beatrice Holloway recovered from her illness under the care of the castle physician, a stern but skilled man named Master Robert, who had studied medicine in Paris and took his duties seriously. Within a fortnight, she and her daughter had moved into a suite of rooms in the castle's eastern wing. Modest by noble standards, but palatial compared to their cottage in the village. The rooms consisted of a bedchamber with an actual bed frame and feather mattress, a small sitting room with a fireplace, and even a tiny private closet. Luxuries that Beatrice had never dreamed of possessing. Her daughter, whose name was Anna, had initially been overwhelmed by the castle's size and grandeur, moving through the corridors with the wide-eyed wonder of a child exploring a new world. But she proved adaptable and intelligent, quickly learning the layout of the castle and making friends among the other servants' children. She had her mother's dark hair and steady gaze, but where Beatrice's features showed the wear of hardship, Anna's face still held the soft beauty of youth. At 17, she was blossoming into a lovely young woman, though she seemed unconscious of her own appeal, focused instead on helping her mother adjust to their new circumstances. Beatrice herself threw herself into her new duties with the dedication of someone who understood she had been given an extraordinary second chance. The position of keeper of household accounts had indeed been created specifically for her, but Edmund had not exaggerated the need for such work. The castle's financial records were in chaos, kept haphazardly by various stewards and servants who had their own systems that rarely agreed with each other. Bills went unpaid while others were paid twice. Supplies were over-ordered in some areas and neglected in others, and there was no clear picture of the household's actual expenses or budget. Beatrice brought order to this chaos with a methodical approach that impressed even Lord Thornwood, who had initially been skeptical of Edmund's decision to hire her. She established a central ledger system, recording every transaction in her careful script, tracking patterns of expenditure, and identifying areas where money was being wasted through inefficiency or outright theft. Within 3 weeks, she had uncovered 2 servants who were skimming funds, presented Lord Thornwood with detailed evidence of their crimes, and recommended their dismissal. She had also identified ways to save the household nearly 20% on food costs by purchasing directly from farmers rather than through middlemen, and had negotiated better rates with several suppliers by committing to regular, reliable orders. Edmund watched these changes with a mixture of satisfaction and growing respect. He had offered Beatrice the position partly out of guilt, partly as a way to assuage his conscience for his earlier cruelty, but he was discovering that his impulsive decision had actually benefited the castle significantly. More than that, he found himself seeking out Beatrice's counsel on matters beyond just household accounts. She had a practical wisdom born of hardship, an ability to see through pretense to the heart of matters, that he found increasingly valuable. It was during one of these consultations, nearly a month after Beatrice had taken up her position, that Edmund found himself really noticing Anna for the first time. He had come to Beatrice's small office, a room near the kitchens where she worked at a desk piled with ledgers and papers, to discuss the costs of the recent military expedition against the bandits. Anna was there, helping her mother sort through receipts, and as Edmund entered, she looked up with a smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "Your Highness," Anna said, rising and curtsying with the grace she had been learning from the other castle women. "Mother said you would be coming by. I'll leave you to your business." "There's no need," Edmund found himself saying, surprised by his own words. "If you're helping your mother with the accounts, you should hear this as well. It will be good training for you." Anna glanced at her mother, who nodded permission and settled back into her seat. Edmund pulled up a chair and spread out the papers he had brought, but found his attention divided between the figures on the page and the young woman across from him. There was something compelling about Anna that went beyond her physical beauty. She had an alertness, an intelligence in her eyes that suggested depths worth exploring. When she asked questions about the accounts, they were perceptive ones that showed she understood not just the numbers, but their implications. Over the following weeks, Edmund found himself creating excuses to visit Beatrice's office, ostensibly to discuss household matters, but increasingly to see Anna as well. He told himself it was merely friendly interest, that he was being kind to the daughter of a woman he had wronged. But the truth was more complicated. He was drawn to Anna in ways he had not experienced with the noble ladies of the court, whose beauty was often matched by a calculation and artificiality that left him cold. Anna was genuine, her emotions written clearly on her face, her reactions unguarded and honest. Anna, for her part, seemed equally drawn to Edmund, though she was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries of rank and station. She would blush when he entered the room, her cheeks coloring in a way that Edmund found charming. She listened to his stories of the court and his travels with evident interest, asking questions that showed she was truly engaged, rather than merely being polite. And when she laughed at his attempts at humor, the sound was like music, clear and unforced and utterly delightful. Beatrice watched these developing interactions with mixed feelings. She was grateful to Edmund beyond measure for what he had done for her and Anna, for giving them security and comfort they had never known. But she was also a mother, and she could see the attraction growing between the prince and her daughter with a clarity that apparently eluded them both. She knew the dangers inherent in such an attachment. Edmund was a prince, destined to marry a woman of noble birth as political and dynastic considerations demanded. Anna was a commoner, the daughter of a blacksmith and a widow who had been the subject of the prince's mockery mere weeks ago. Nothing good could come of a romance between them, no matter how genuine their feelings might be. Yet Beatrice hesitated to intervene directly. Edmund had changed since that day he had come to their cottage in Millbrook. The cruel, dismissive young man who had mocked her in the great hall had given way to someone more thoughtful, more conscious of his responsibilities and the weight they carried. She had heard from other servants about how he had stopped making casual jests at others' expense, how he listened more carefully during petitions, how he had established a fund to help the families of soldiers killed in the bandit raid. He was becoming the kind of prince his father had been, and Beatrice suspected that her inadvertent role in catalyzing that change was part of why he was drawn to Anna. He associated them with his own transformation, with becoming a better man. Spring arrived early that year, the snow melting rapidly as warmer winds blew in from the south. The castle grounds transformed from white and barren to green and growing, crocuses and snowdrops pushing up through the earth in explosions of purple and white. The river that ran past the castle swelled with meltwater, its surface sparkling in the strengthening sunlight. Birds returned from their winter migrations, filling the air with song, and the entire world seemed to shake off winter's lethargy and embrace renewal. Edmund marked the change of seasons by organizing a hunt, a tradition that dated back generations in his family. It would be a grand affair, with nobles invited from neighboring estates, a chance to celebrate the end of winter and strengthen political alliances through shared sport. Preparations consumed the castle for weeks. Guest chambers had to be prepared, special foods ordered, hunting dogs trained and readied, horses exercised and brought to peak condition. Anna watched these preparations with fascination, her duties now expanded to include helping manage the increased household expenses that came with hosting such an event. She spent long hours with her mother, going over budgets and supply lists, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. Edmund found excuses to be present during many of these sessions, offering input on the guests' preferences, describing past hunts and the traditions surrounding them, his presence becoming so regular that the servants began to talk. Geoffrey noticed, of course. He confronted Edmund one evening as they sat in Edmund's chambers, sharing wine after a long day of hunt preparations. "You're spending a great deal of time with the widow's daughter," Geoffrey observed, his tone carefully neutral. "People are beginning to notice. More importantly, people are beginning to talk." Edmund, who had been staring into the fire with a contemplative expression, turned to face his friend. "Let them talk. I'm doing nothing improper. Anna and her mother are helping to manage the household accounts, and I need to coordinate with them regularly." "Edmund," Geoffrey said, his voice dropping to something more serious, "we've been friends since we were children. I've stood beside you in battle and held your secrets. So trust me when I say that what I see in your eyes when you look at that girl goes well beyond coordinating household accounts. You're falling for her, and that's dangerous for both of you." "And what if I am?" Edmund demanded, his voice rising defensively. "Is it so wrong to care for someone who is genuine and honest, who sees me as a man rather than just a title and a political alliance?" "It's not wrong to care," Geoffrey replied carefully, "but it's naive to think this can end anywhere but badly. You're a prince, Edmund. Your marriage will be a matter of state, arranged to strengthen alliances and secure borders. You cannot marry a commoner, no matter how much you might wish to. And if you pursue this attraction without the possibility of marriage, you'll be using her, taking advantage of the power you hold over her family. Is that the man you want to be?" The words hit Edmund like physical blows, partly because they articulated fears he had been trying not to examine too closely. He slumped back in his chair, the fight going out of him. "I don't know what to do, Geoffrey. I can't stop thinking about her. When I'm dealing with tedious matters of state, I find myself counting the hours until I can see her again. When she smiles at me, it's like the sun breaking through clouds. I've never felt this way about anyone." Geoffrey's expression softened with sympathy. "I know, I can see it. But feelings, no matter how powerful, don't change the realities of your position. You need to decide what you're going to do before this goes any further, before either of you is hurt beyond repair." Edmund knew his friend was right, but knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things. He spent a restless night wrestling with his thoughts, torn between duty and desire, between the expectations of his position and the unexpected feelings that had taken root in his heart. The next morning brought news that drove personal concerns temporarily from his mind. A messenger arrived from London, bearing letters sealed with the royal insignia. Edmund's elder brother, King Richard, was summoning him to court for consultations about the bandit problem and the evidence of larger conspiracies that Edmund's raid had uncovered. The interrogation of the captured bandits had yielded information about a network of disaffected nobles and foreign agents working to destabilize the northern territories, and the king wanted Edmund's first-hand account of what he had discovered. Edmund was to leave within a week, bringing with him key witnesses and all evidence collected. The journey to London would take at least 10 days each way, and his business at court might keep him there for weeks or even months depending on how the investigations proceeded. It meant postponing the hunt he had been planning, disappointing the invited guests, and leaving Ravenshold in Lord Thornwood's capable but elderly hands during what might prove to be a critical period. It also meant leaving Anna, and Edmund was surprised by how much the thought pained him. He realized with sudden clarity that Geoffrey had been right, that his feelings had deepened beyond mere attraction into something more profound and potentially more dangerous. He needed to resolve this situation before he left, needed to understand what Anna felt, and whether there was any path forward that did not lead to heartbreak. He found her that afternoon in the castle gardens, which were just beginning to show signs of spring growth. She was sitting on a stone bench beside a fountain that had only recently been uncovered from its winter wrapping, reading from a book of poetry that someone had lent her. The sunlight caught in her dark hair, turning it to shades of mahogany and gold, and she looked so beautiful in that moment that Edmund felt his breath catch in his chest. "Anna," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and her face lit with a smile that made his heart race. "Your Highness, I didn't expect to see you this afternoon. Mother said you had meetings with Lord Thornwood about your journey to London." "The meetings can wait," Edmund replied, moving to sit beside her on the bench, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes. "I wanted to talk to you before I leave. There's something I need to say, something I should have said weeks ago." Anna's expression grew more serious, though the smile did not entirely fade. "What is it, Your Highness?" Edmund took a deep breath, aware that he was about to step off a precipice with no clear idea of where he would land. "My name is Edmund. When we're alone like this, I would like you to use it. And I need you to know that these past weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, have been among the happiest of my life. You've become important to me, Anna. More important than is probably wise for either of us." Anna's cheeks colored, but she held his gaze steadily. "You've become important to me as well, Edmund. I think about you constantly. I find myself listening for your footsteps in the corridor, hoping you'll come to visit. When you're gone, everything seems duller, less interesting. Is that wrong of me? Should I try to stop feeling this way? I don't know," Edmund admitted, reaching out to take her hand in his, marveling at how perfectly it fit, how right it felt to touch her. "I don't know what's right or wrong anymore. I only know that I'll be leaving soon, possibly for a long time, and I couldn't go without telling you how I feel, without knowing if you might feel the same." Anna's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when she spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "I do feel the same. I have for weeks now, though I kept telling myself it was foolish, that a prince could never care for someone like me. But I can't help it, Edmund. I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrible and irrevocable. Edmund felt joy and despair in equal measure, elation that she returned his feelings warring with the knowledge of all the obstacles that stood between them. He leaned closer, drawn by an impulse stronger than reason, and kissed her gently, her lips soft and warm against his. It was a chaste kiss, tender rather than passionate, but it sealed something between them. A commitment made without words, but no less binding for that. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. Anna touched her fingers to her lips, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. "What does this mean?" she whispered. "What happens now?" Edmund took both her hands in his, holding them tightly as though he could anchor them both against the uncertain future. "I don't know," he said honestly. "There are complications. obstacles that I cannot simply wish away. But I promise you this, Anna. I will find a way for us to be together. I don't know how yet, but I will find a way. Will you wait for me while I'm gone? Will you trust me to solve this? Anna nodded, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll wait. But Edmund, you must promise me something in return. Promise that you won't sacrifice your honor or your duty for me. Promise that whatever solution you find, it will be one you can live with. One that doesn't require you to become someone you're not. It was a harder promise to make than she perhaps realized, but Edmund gave it anyway, sealing it with another kiss that lasted longer than the first, that spoke of longing and hope and the desperate wish that love might somehow be enough to overcome the divisions of birth and station that separated them. Edmund's departure for London came too quickly, though he had used every hour before it to be near Anna. They met in the gardens when they could, stealing moments together that were precious precisely because they knew how fleeting they were. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams for the future, their fears and hopes. Edmund learned that Anna had taught herself to read using her father's old prayer book, that she loved the changing of seasons and the first snowfall of winter, that she had once dreamed of traveling beyond the small world of Millbrook Village, but had resigned herself to a life bounded by fields and familiar faces until Edmund had changed everything. Anna learned that Edmund's confidence masked deep insecurities about living up to his father's legacy, that he sometimes felt trapped by the expectations of his position, that the cruelty he had shown her mother had been born of frustration and a misguided belief that hardness equaled strength. She saw in him a man struggling to reconcile who he had been with who he wanted to become, and she loved him all the more for that struggle, for his willingness to change and grow. Beatrice watched these developments with growing concern, but she held her tongue. She trusted Edmund's essential goodness, believed in the transformation she had witnessed, but she was also a practical woman who understood that love, however genuine, did not conquer all obstacles. She could only hope that Edmund's promise to find a solution was more than romantic optimism, that he truly had some plan that might allow him and Anna to be together without destroying them both in the process. The morning of Edmund's departure was cold and gray, the spring weather retreating temporarily as clouds rolled in from the north bringing the threat of rain. Edmund stood in the bailey surrounded by his traveling party, Geoffrey and 20 soldiers who would serve as escort, the captured bandits who were being transported to London for trial, scribes carrying documents related to the conspiracy investigation, and pack horses laden with supplies for the journey. Lord Thornwood was there to see him off, along with most of the household staff and many of the castle's residents. Anna stood with her mother near the back of the crowd, trying to maintain a neutral expression, even as her heart felt like it was being torn from her chest. She had said her private goodbye to Edmund the night before, in the garden under a moon that played hide and seek with the clouds. They had held each other close, exchanging whispered promises and lingering kisses, both trying not to think about how long it might be before they saw each other again. Now, as Edmund mounted Thunder and took up his position at the head of the column, their eyes met across the crowded bailey. The look they exchanged lasted only seconds, but it contained volumes: love, longing, fear, determination, and the fragile hope that somehow, despite everything, they would find their way back to each other. Then Edmund turned his horse toward the gate, raised his hand in farewell to the assembled crowd, and rode out with his men falling into formation behind him. Anna watched until the last rider disappeared through the gate, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, and then she turned and walked quickly back into the castle, not wanting anyone to see the tears that threatened to fall. Beatrice followed, placing a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder, but saying nothing. Sometimes there were no words adequate to ease pain, and a mother's presence had to be enough. The journey to London took 12 days, slowed by the prisoners who had to be transported securely, and by spring rains that turned the roads to rivers of mud. Edmund used the time to think, to plan, to consider every possible approach to the problem of his love for Anna. By the time the walls of London came into view, rising gray and imposing against the horizon, he had the beginnings of an idea, audacious and unprecedented, but perhaps, just perhaps, possible. London in spring was the assault on the senses after the relative quiet of Ravenshold. The city teemed with life, merchants hawking their wares in crowded streets, nobles in fine carriages splashing through mud and filth, beggars calling out for alms, children darting between legs of horses and pedestrians, the constant din of thousands of voices speaking in dozens of dialects and languages. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of humanity, animals, cooking food, waste, and the River Thames that ran through the city's heart, carrying commerce and refuse in equal measure. The royal palace was located on the northern bank of the Thames, a sprawling complex of buildings that had been expanded and modified by successive monarchs until it had become a small city unto itself. Edmund's party was met at the gates by royal guards who escorted them through courtyards and corridors to the apartments that had been prepared for Edmund's use. After the simplicity of Ravenshold, the palace seemed almost suffocatingly ornate, every surface covered with carvings or paintings or tapestries, every room lit by dozens of candles that created dancing shadows and a constant smell of beeswax and smoke. Edmund was given only enough time to wash the dust of travel from his face and change into clothes appropriate for court before he was summoned to an audience with his brother. King Richard III received him in a private chamber rather than the throne room, a sign that this was to be a personal meeting rather than a formal state occasion. The room was comfortably appointed with chairs covered in velvet, a table laden with wine and refreshments, and a fire burning cheerfully in an ornate fireplace carved with the royal coat of arms. Richard was 29, 3 years Edmund's senior, and looked every inch a king. He was tall like Edmund but leaner, with the same dark hair, though his was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples. His face was more angular than Edmund's, with sharp cheekbones and a thin nose that gave him an aristocratic appearance. He wore a doublet of royal blue velvet over a shirt of white silk, with a heavy gold chain around his neck bearing the great seal of the kingdom. Despite the formal attire, his manner was warm as he embraced Edmund in greeting. "Brother, it's good to see you, though I wish the circumstances were happier. Come sit, tell me everything about these bandits and their mysterious backers. Your letters were informative but necessarily brief. I want to hear the full story from your own lips." They spent the next several hours in discussion, Edmund recounting the bandit raid, the battle at Blackthorn Abbey, the weapons and armor that had been found, and the confessions extracted from prisoners. The investigation had revealed a conspiracy involving several minor nobles who resented the crown's growing power, foreign merchants who wanted to destabilize English trade routes to their own benefit, and even a few church officials who believed that chaos might provide opportunities for the church to expand its temporal authority. Richard listened intently, asking sharp questions that revealed a keen political mind. He had been king for only 2 years, ascending the throne after their father's death, and had spent that time consolidating his power and dealing with various threats to his rule. This conspiracy was serious, potentially threatening the stability of the entire northern region, and he took it very seriously indeed. "You've done well, Edmund," Richard said when the briefing was complete. "Your swift action prevented this from growing into something much worse. I'm going to establish a commission to investigate further, root out all those involved, and make examples of the ringleaders. I'd like you to sit on that commission, lend your knowledge and experience to the effort." Edmund had expected this, and while part of him chafed at the idea of spending months in London sitting through tedious hearings and examinations, he knew it was his duty. "Of course, Your Majesty, I serve at your pleasure." Richard smiled, and some of the formality dropped away as he reverted to being Edmund's older brother rather than his king. "Please, when we're alone like this, I'm still Richard. Save the Your Majesty for public occasions. Now, there's another matter I wanted to discuss with you, something personal rather than political." Edmund felt his stomach tighten with apprehension, wondering if somehow word of his feelings for Anna had reached London ahead of him. "What matter is that?" "Your marriage," Richard said bluntly. "You're 26 years old, Edmund. It's past time you took a wife and began producing heirs. I've been in negotiations with several noble houses, and I believe I've found an excellent match. Lady Catherine Pembroke, daughter of the Duke of Wessex. She's 19, well-educated, accomplished in all the feminine arts, and by all accounts quite beautiful. More importantly, her father controls significant territories in the south, and an alliance with his house would strengthen our position considerably." The words hit Edmund like hammer blows. He had known this was coming, had understood intellectually that his marriage would be a matter of state rather than personal choice. But hearing it stated so baldly, with a specific woman already selected, made it terrifyingly real. He thought of Anna waiting for him at Ravenshold, of the promises they had made to each other, and felt panic rising in his chest. "I understand the political necessity," Edmund said carefully, choosing his words with extreme caution. "But I wonder if we might delay such arrangements for a while longer, at least until this conspiracy investigation is complete. It seems inappropriate to be planning celebrations when we're dealing with threats to the realm." Richard waved away this objection with an impatient gesture. "The wedding wouldn't take place immediately. These things take time to arrange properly, but I want the betrothal announced soon, within the next month or two. It will send a message about stability and continuity, show that the crown is looking to the future rather than being consumed by present troubles. Besides, I've already given Duke Pembroke my word that we would proceed. To back out now would be an insult that could turn an ally into an enemy." Edmund felt trapped, the walls of the comfortable chamber seeming to close in around him. He had to tell Richard the truth, had to explain about Anna and ask for his brother's understanding and help. But looking at Richard's expectant face, at the king rather than the brother, Edmund found himself hesitating. How could he explain that he had fallen in love with a commoner, the daughter of a blacksmith and a woman he had once publicly humiliated? How could he ask his brother to jeopardize a valuable political alliance for what would seem like a momentary infatuation? "I need time to think about this," Edmund said finally, knowing it was a weak response but unable to commit to anything else. "May I have a few days to consider the matter before we proceed with any announcements?" Richard's expression showed disappointment, but not anger. "Of course. I understand this is a significant step. Take the time you need, within reason. But Edmund, understand that this is not truly a choice. Your position, your duty to the crown and to our family, requires that you marry advantageously. Personal preferences must be secondary to political necessity. That's the burden we bear as royalty." The words were not unkind, but they were final, the pronouncement of a king rather than the advice of a brother. Edmund bowed his head in acknowledgement and took his leave, his mind racing as he made his way through the palace corridors to his own apartments. Geoffrey was waiting there, having unpacked their belongings and arranged the rooms to his satisfaction. "How was the audience?" Geoffrey asked, taking one look at Edmund's face and immediately pouring 2 large cups of wine. "That bad?" Edmund took the offered wine and drank deeply before answering. "Richard wants me married. He's already selected the bride, negotiated with her father, given his word. Lady Catherine Pembroke, daughter of the Duke of Wessex. The betrothal is to be announced within weeks." Geoffrey let out a low whistle. "That's a prestigious match. The Duke controls half the southern coast. But given your face right now, I'm guessing you're not celebrating. How can I?" Edmund demanded, his voice rising with frustration and desperation. "I'm in love with Anna. I made her promises, Geoffrey. I told her I would find a way for us to be together. How do I keep that promise while fulfilling my duty to marry a woman I've never even met?" Geoffrey was quiet for a long moment, staring into his wine as though it might contain answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I don't think you can, Edmund. I don't think there is a way to have both. You're going to have to choose, duty or love. And if you choose love, you'll be giving up everything. Your title, your position, your family, your entire life as you've known it. Are you prepared to do that? Is any woman worth that much?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable because Edmund himself did not know the answer. He thought of Anna's smile, the way she looked at him as though he were the only person in the world that mattered. He thought of their conversations in the garden, the connection he felt with her that went deeper than anything he had experienced with anyone else. He thought of the promises he had made, the certainty he had felt in that moment that love could overcome any obstacle. But he also thought of his father's legacy, of the responsibilities that came with his birth and position. He thought of the people of Ravenshold who depended on him, of his duty to his brother and the kingdom. He thought of the political consequences if he refused this marriage, the alliance that would be lost, the insult to the Duke of Wessex that could turn a powerful noble into an enemy. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a physical burden, making it hard to breathe. "I need to think," Edmund said finally. "I need time to figure out if there's any solution I haven't considered, any way to reconcile these competing demands." He spent the next 3 days largely alone, declining invitations to court functions and social gatherings, instead walking the streets of London or sitting in his rooms wrestling with his dilemma. He considered every possibility he could imagine, convincing Richard to break off the negotiations with the Duke, claiming some impediment to the marriage. Even the desperate notion of abdicating his title and running away with Anna to start a new life somewhere far from England. Each option seemed worse than the last, fraught with consequences he could not accept. On the fourth day, an idea came to him, born of desperation but perhaps workable. He sought out Richard in the Royal Library, a vast chamber filled with books and manuscripts collected over generations. His brother was studying maps of the Northern Territories, planning defensive improvements based on Edmund's report of the conspiracy. "Richard," Edmund said without preamble, "I need to ask you something important. Is there any precedent for a prince marrying a commoner and retaining his title and position?" Richard looked up from his maps, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Why would you ask such a question? Edmund, please tell me you haven't done something foolish." "I haven't," Edmund assured him quickly, "but I need to know if it's possible, if there's any legal or historical precedent for such a union." Richard set down the map he had been holding and regarded his brother with a mixture of worry and curiosity. "There are a few cases scattered through history, though most ended badly. King Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow, and it caused enormous political problems. Several continental monarchs have married below their station, usually with papal dispensation, and generally it weakened their political position significantly." "Why are you asking, Edmund? What's this really about?" Edmund took a deep breath, knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. He could continue to hide his feelings, to hope for some miracle that would never come, or he could be honest with his brother and face whatever consequences came from that honesty. He chose truth. "I've fallen in love," Edmund said simply, "with a woman who is extraordinary in every way that matters, but who lacks the noble birth that would make her an acceptable match by conventional standards. Her name is Anna Holloway. She's the daughter of Beatrice Holloway, the woman I wronged, and then tried to make amends to by giving her a position in my household. Anna is intelligent, kind, genuine, everything I never knew I was looking for, and I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else." Richard was silent for so long that Edmund began to fear he had made a terrible mistake in confessing. But when his brother finally spoke, his voice was not angry but sad, filled with a sympathy that somehow made it worse. "Oh, Edmund, I understand what you're feeling, truly I do. But you must know that this is impossible. Setting aside the political complications, which are enormous, think about what you would be asking this woman to endure. She would be thrust into a world completely foreign to her, surrounded by nobles who would despise her for her low birth, subjected to constant scrutiny and criticism, never fully accepted no matter what she accomplished. You might love her, but would that love survive the reality of what her life would become?" The words struck home because Edmund had thought similar things himself during his 3 days of contemplation. He had imagined bringing Anna to court, seen in his mind's eye the sneers and whispers that would follow her, the impossible standards she would be held to, the way every mistake or social misstep would be magnified and used as evidence of her unsuitability. Would his love be enough to sustain her through that? Would hers be enough to sustain him? "What if I gave up my title?" Edmund asked, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "What if I renounced my claim, lived as a common man? Could I do that?" Richard's expression hardened, and for a moment Edmund saw not his brother but his king, a man who would not tolerate such talk even from family. "You could not. You are a prince of the realm, Edmund. That is not a coat you can simply remove when it becomes inconvenient. You have duties, responsibilities that were yours from birth. Thousands of people depend on you, on the stability your position provides. To abandon that for personal desire would be the height of selfishness." The harsh words were like cold water, shocking Edmund back to reality. Richard was right, of course he was right. Edmund had spent weeks learning to be less selfish, to consider the needs of others, to understand that his position carried obligations as well as privileges. How could he reconcile that growth with the ultimate selfish act of abandoning everything for love? "Then what do I do?" Edmund asked, and heard the defeat in his own voice. "How do I marry Lady Catherine while loving Anna? How do I betray either one of them?" Richard moved around the table and placed his hands on Edmund's shoulders, looking him directly in the eyes. "You make the choice that duty demands, however much it costs you personally. You marry Lady Catherine, you do your duty to your family and your kingdom, and you let Anna go to find happiness with someone who can give her the life she deserves. It will hurt, Edmund. It will hurt both of you terribly. But sometimes being a leader means making choices that cause pain because they're necessary. Father understood that. Now you must as well. Edmund wanted to argue, to rage against the unfairness of a world where love mattered less than politics, where two people who cared for each other deeply could not be together simply because of the circumstances of their births. But he knew, deep in his heart where honesty lived, that Richard was right. He was a prince, and that meant sacrifice. It meant duty. It meant putting the needs of the kingdom before his own desires, no matter how much it cost him. He nodded slowly, feeling something break inside him even as he accepted the necessity of what had to be done. I understand. I'll meet Lady Catherine. I'll proceed with the betrothal as you wish, but I need to return to Ravenshold first, to settle some affairs and to say goodbye properly. Can you give me that much? Richard's expression softened with sympathy and sadness. Take 2 weeks. Put your affairs in order, do what needs to be done. But Edmund, when you return to London, it must be with the understanding that the betrothal will proceed. I need your word on that. You have it, Edmund said, and felt the words seal his fate as surely as any oath sworn on holy relics. He had made his choice, or rather, duty had made it for him. Now all that remained was the hardest part, telling Anna that despite his promises, despite his love, they could not be together. The journey back to Ravenshold was the longest of Edmund's life, though it took no more time than the journey to London had. Every mile brought him closer to a conversation he dreaded, to the moment when he would have to break Anna's heart and his own in the process. He rode in silence, deaf to Geoffrey's attempts at conversation, blind to the beauty of the spring countryside bursting into full bloom around them. The world seemed to have lost its color, everything rendered in shades of gray that matched his mood. Geoffrey, understanding his friend's pain even if he believed the decision was right, left him alone with his thoughts. The other soldiers in their escort sensed their prince's dark mood and kept their own conversation muted, their usual bawdy songs and jokes silenced by respect or fear or simple compassion. They rode through villages and past farms where people waved or bowed as the prince's party passed, unaware that the man they honored felt more wretched than the poorest beggar huddled in the ditch. It was late afternoon when Ravenshold Castle finally came into view, its gray stone walls gilded by the slanting sunlight of approaching evening. Edmund felt his chest tighten at the sight, knowing that somewhere within those walls Anna waited for him, hoping for good news, expecting him to have found the solution he had promised. The thought of disappointing her, of watching hope die in those beautiful blue eyes, was almost more than he could bear. The castle erupted with activity at their arrival, servants running to take horses, soldiers calling out greetings to their comrades, Lord Thornwood emerging from the great hall to welcome his prince home. Edmund went through the motions of greeting, of accepting the steward's report on affairs during his absence, of issuing orders and responding to questions, but his mind was elsewhere, searching the crowd of faces for the one that mattered most. He found her standing near the entrance to the keep, partially hidden behind a stone pillar, as though she was trying to remain inconspicuous. Their eyes met across the crowded bailey, and Edmund saw the hope in her face, the love and longing and desperate need to believe that everything would be all right. He tried to smile, to give her some sign of reassurance, but his face would not cooperate, and he saw her expression begin to change, hope giving way to doubt and the first stirrings of fear. Edmund excused himself from Lord Thornwood as quickly as courtesy allowed and made his way toward Anna, each step feeling like he was walking to his own execution. She met him at the base of the keep stairs, her hands twisting nervously in her skirts, her face now pale with apprehension. "Edmund," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're back. I've missed you so much. Did you find a way?" He could not answer her here, not in the bailey with dozens of eyes watching and ears listening. "Come with me," he said quietly, taking her hand and leading her up the stairs into the keep, through corridors she had learned to navigate during his absence, until they reached the small solar where he sometimes went to escape the demands of his position. It was a modest room with a single window overlooking the gardens, furnished with a few chairs and a table, private enough for the conversation they needed to have. Edmund closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment, gathering his courage. When he turned to face Anna, he found her standing in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, as though she was trying to hold herself together, her eyes already bright with unshed tears because she could read the truth in his face before he spoke a word. "It's not good news, is it?" Anna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You couldn't find a way." Edmund crossed the room and took her hands in his, holding them tightly as though he could somehow transfer his strength to her, or perhaps draw strength from her to do what had to be done. "I tried, Anna. I swear to you, I explored every possibility I could imagine. I even offered to give up my title, to renounce my position and live as a common man if that would allow us to be together. But my brother, the king, he made me understand that I cannot. I have duties, responsibilities that I cannot abandon no matter how much I might wish to. There are too many people depending on me, too many consequences that would flow from such a selfish choice." Anna's tears began to fall, silent tracks of grief down her pale cheeks. "So that's it? We just give up? Pretend these past months meant nothing? Go back to being strangers?" "No," Edmund said fiercely, pulling her closer until they were only inches apart. "What we shared meant everything, Anna. It changed me, made me a better man, taught me what it means to truly care for another person beyond my own wants and needs. I will carry that with me for the rest of my life. But Richard has arranged a marriage for me, a political alliance with a noble house that will strengthen the kingdom. The betrothal will be announced when I return to London in 2 weeks. I cannot refuse it without causing serious harm to people who have done nothing to deserve such treatment." Anna pulled her hands free and turned away, wrapping her arms around herself again, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Edmund stood helplessly, wanting to comfort her, but knowing that his touch would only make things worse, that there was no comfort he could offer that would ease this pain. "I knew," Anna said finally, her voice thick with tears. "I knew from the beginning that this was how it would end. I told myself not to hope, not to dream, that princes don't marry blacksmiths' daughters no matter how much they might care for them. But you made me believe it was possible, Edmund. You made me think that love could be enough." The accusation in her words, gentle as it was, cut Edmund deeper than any blade. She was right. He had given her hope, had made promises he should have known he could not keep, had allowed them both to fall in love despite knowing how impossible their situation was. In trying to be better than the cruel prince who had mocked her mother, he had inadvertently caused even greater harm. "I'm sorry," Edmund said, the words utterly inadequate but the only ones he had. "I'm so sorry, Anna. I should never have let this happen. I should have been stronger, should have kept my distance, should have protected you from this pain. This is my fault, all of it." Anna turned back to face him, and despite her tears, there was no hatred in her eyes, only a profound sadness that somehow made it worse. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't take away what we had by making it a mistake. These months with you were the happiest of my life, Edmund. You made me feel special, valued, loved in a way I never imagined possible. Even if it ends now, even if we can never be together, I wouldn't trade that for anything. The pain I feel now is worth the joy I felt then." Her grace in this moment, her ability to find something positive even in heartbreak, made Edmund love her even more and made what he had to do even harder. He moved to stand before her again, cupping her face in his hands and wiping away her tears with his thumbs, memorizing every detail of her features because he knew this was likely the last time they would be alone together like this. "You deserve so much more than I can give you," Edmund said, his own voice breaking with emotion. "You deserve a man who can love you openly, who can build a life with you without complications or compromises, who can give you the happiness you should have. I want you to find that, Anna. I want you to move on from me and find someone worthy of you." Anna placed her hands over his, holding them against her face as though she could keep him there forever through sheer force of will. "I don't want someone else. I want you. But I understand that we cannot always have what we want, no matter how much we might deserve it. So I will do as you ask. I will try to move on, to build a life without you. But know this, Edmund. I will love you until the day I die. No matter who I marry or what life I lead, part of my heart will always belong to you." They stood there for a long moment, forehead to forehead, breathing in sync, trying to memorize the feeling of being close to each other before they had to let go. Then Edmund kissed her one final time, pouring all his love and regret and sorrow into that kiss, and felt her respond with equal intensity, both of them trying to say everything that words could not express. When they finally pulled apart, Edmund forced himself to step back, to put distance between them before his resolve could crumble. "I've arranged for you and your mother to be transferred to one of my estates in the south," he said, his voice now carefully controlled, reverting to the formal tone of a lord making arrangements for his servants. "It's a beautiful manor house with extensive lands, far from here and from London. You'll be comfortable there, and you'll have the distance you need to heal. Lord Thornwood has the details. You should leave within the week, before I return to London." Anna nodded, understanding what he was really saying, that they could not be in the same place, that seeing each other would make moving on impossible for both of them. "What about my mother's position here? The work she's been doing?" "She can continue it at the new estate, managing the household accounts there. Or she can retire completely if she prefers, with a generous pension that will ensure you're both comfortable for the rest of your lives." "I owe her that much and more for what I did to her, and for what I'm doing to you now." The formality was a shield, a way to get through this conversation without completely breaking down, and Anna seemed to understand that. She curtsied, a gesture she had rarely made to him in private, and when she spoke, her voice matched his in its careful neutrality. "Thank you, Your Highness. Your generosity is appreciated. If there's nothing else, I should return to my mother and inform her of these new arrangements." Edmund wanted to scream that there was everything else, that he wanted to take back every word and damn the consequences, that he wanted to hold her and never let go. But he simply nodded and said, "You're dismissed." Anna walked to the door with her head held high, her back straight despite the tears that still fell, and Edmund was reminded powerfully of her mother, walking out of the great hall after he had mocked her. Both women had more dignity in defeat than Edmund felt he possessed in victory. At the door, Anna paused and looked back one final time. "Be happy, Edmund," she said softly. "Or if you cannot be happy, then at least be good. Be the prince your father wanted you to be, the man I know you can be. Don't let this destroy the progress you've made. Promise me that." "I promise," Edmund said, though he had no idea how he would keep that promise when he felt like his heart had been torn from his chest. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded like the ceiling of a tomb. Edmund stood alone in the solar, staring at the closed door, and finally allowed himself to break. He sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs he had held back for too long, grieving for what he had lost and what he could never have. The next week passed in a blur of activity and avoidance. Edmund threw himself into his duties with almost manic intensity, meeting with Lord Thornwood for hours to review every aspect of the estate's management, inspecting the garrison, and personally overseeing training exercises, riding out to visit farms and villages to hear petitions and resolve disputes. Anything to keep busy, to fill his mind with tasks that left no room for thought or feeling. He did not see Anna again. She and Beatrice kept to their rooms, preparing for the move south, and Edmund made sure his schedule never brought him near their part of the castle. He told himself it was kindness, that seeing each other would only make things harder, but he knew it was also cowardice, an inability to face the consequences of his choices one more time. On the morning of their departure, Edmund watched from his window as a carriage was loaded with their belongings. He saw Beatrice emerge from the keep, moving more easily now than she had when he first met her, the result of better food and medical care. She paused to thank Lord Thornwood, who was overseeing the departure, and Edmund could see even from this distance the genuine warmth in her expression. Whatever anger she might have felt toward him for breaking her daughter's heart, she was still grateful for what he had done for them both. Then Anna appeared, and Edmund's breath caught in his chest. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool that he had never seen before, her dark hair braided and coiled at the nape of her neck, her face composed and calm. She looked beautiful and distant, like a stranger rather than the woman who had held his heart. She climbed into the carriage without looking up at the castle windows, without any sign that she was aware of being watched, and Edmund told himself that was for the best, even as something inside him screamed to run down there, to stop the carriage, to damn everything and everyone and simply be with her. But he did not move. He stood at the window and watched the carriage roll through the gates and down the road until it was lost to sight, taking with it the best part of himself, the part that had learned to love selflessly, and leaving behind only the prince, the title, the duty that demanded everything and gave back nothing but emptiness. Geoffrey found him there hours later, still standing at the window, though there was nothing to see but the ordinary life of the castle continuing as it always had. "Edmund," his friend said gently, "it's time. We need to leave for London if we're to arrive in time for the betrothal ceremony." Edmund nodded without turning, his voice flat and emotionless when he spoke. "Have the men prepare to ride at dawn tomorrow. I'll meet Lady Catherine as arranged, proceed with the betrothal and the marriage when the time comes. I'll do my duty, Geoffrey, as I was born to do. That's what matters, isn't it? Duty and obligation and the greater good. Personal happiness is irrelevant." "Edmund," Geoffrey said again, this time with more force, moving to stand beside his friend at the window. "Don't do this. Don't let this turn you bitter and cold again. You've changed so much these past months. Become the kind of leader your father wanted you to be. Don't throw that away because of pain." Edmund finally turned to look at his friend, and Geoffrey was shocked by what he saw in the prince's eyes. Not bitterness or anger, but a terrible emptiness, as though something essential had been hollowed out and nothing remained to fill the void. "I won't," Edmund said quietly. "Anna made me promise not to let this destroy the progress I'd made, to continue being the man I'd become. I'll keep that promise because it's all I have left of her. But Geoffrey, don't expect joy from me. Don't expect enthusiasm or hope or any of the things that make life worth living. I'll do what's required, nothing more and nothing less, and that will have to be enough." The return to London was as silent as the journey to Ravenshold had been, but now Edmund's grief had settled into a dull ache rather than the sharp agony of fresh loss. He went through the motions of living, eating when food was placed before him, sleeping when exhaustion demanded it, responding to questions with appropriate words that meant nothing. He was functioning but not alive, existing but not living, and everyone who knew him could see it. The betrothal ceremony took place in the great hall of the royal palace, a lavish affair attended by hundreds of nobles and church officials. Edmund met Lady Catherine for the first time that day, and found her to be exactly as Richard had described: beautiful, accomplished, polite, and utterly without interest to him. She had golden hair and green eyes and a smile that was pleasant but rehearsed, the expression of someone who had been trained from birth to be an ornament and a political asset. She curtsied to him with perfect grace, spoke to him with appropriate deference, and showed no sign of being a real person beneath the facade of nobility. Edmund spoke his vows of betrothal with a clear voice, placed a ring on Catherine's finger, and accepted the congratulations of the assembled nobles with the dignity expected of a prince. Inside he felt nothing but that same terrible emptiness, as though he were watching someone else go through these motions while his true self was somewhere far away, standing in a garden at Ravenshold beside a young woman with dark hair and honest eyes who had taught him what love meant. The wedding was set for 3 months hence, time for preparations to be made, and for Edmund to complete his work on the conspiracy commission. Those months passed with the same dreamlike quality, days blending into one another without distinction. Edmund performed his duties adequately, his experience and intelligence carrying him through even when his heart was not engaged. He sat through endless hearings, reviewed evidence, questioned witnesses, and helped craft recommendations for how to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. His work was competent but uninspired, lacking the passion and creativity that had marked his handling of the initial bandit crisis. Lady Catherine visited him occasionally, chaperoned encounters where they made stilted conversation and tried to learn about each other with the awkwardness of strangers being forced into intimacy. She was pleasant enough, Edmund supposed, educated and intelligent in her way, but there was no connection between them, no spark of recognition or understanding. They were like actors reading lines, going through the prescribed motions without any genuine emotion behind them. Catherine seemed content with this arrangement, perhaps even preferred it, as though deep feeling would be unseemly for people of their station. Edmund found it suffocating, but saw no alternative. It was 2 weeks before the wedding, during a rare moment alone in his apartments, that Edmund received an unexpected visitor. Geoffrey announced Lord Thornwood, who had traveled from Ravenshold with urgent news that could not be entrusted to a letter. Edmund received him in his study, noting with concern the older man's obvious agitation. "Your Highness," Thornwood said, dispensing with the usual pleasantries in his distress, "I have grave news from the southern estate where you sent Mistress Holloway and her daughter. There's been an outbreak of fever in the region, a virulent illness that has claimed many lives. Beatrice has fallen ill, and the reports suggest she may not survive. Her daughter sent word begging for help, for access to better physicians than the local village can provide. Edmund felt as though he had been struck. He had sent Beatrice and Anna away to protect them, to give them a fresh start away from the painful memories of Ravenshold, and instead he had inadvertently placed them in danger. The thought of Beatrice dying, of Anna losing her mother after everything else she had endured, was unbearable. "Prepare horses," Edmund ordered, already moving toward the door. "I'm leaving for the estate immediately." "Your Highness," Thornwood protested, "the wedding is in 2 weeks. You have responsibilities here, preparations to oversee, and the fever is highly contagious. You would be putting yourself at serious risk." Edmund turned to face the steward, and for the first time in months, there was fire in his eyes, something alive beneath the empty facade he had been wearing. "I don't care about the risk. Beatrice is ill because I sent her there, because I was trying to make my own life easier without fully considering the consequences for her and Anna. I will not abandon them now. Inform the king that I've been called away on urgent business and will return as soon as possible. If he has objections, he can take them up with me when I get back." The ride south took 2 days of hard travel, Edmund pushing the pace until the horses were lathered and the men exhausted. They arrived at the estate just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across a manor house that would have seemed beautiful under other circumstances. Now it looked haunted, many windows dark, an air of sickness and fear hanging over the place like a miasma. A servant met them at the door, a woman with gray hair and tired eyes, who led Edmund immediately to the sick room. "She's been asking for you, Your Highness," the servant said quietly. "Her daughter said you would come, that you wouldn't forget them, but I wasn't sure." I'm glad she was right. The bedchamber was dim, lit only by candles and a low fire, the air thick with the smell of sickness and the herbs that had been burned in a futile attempt to purify it. Beatrice lay in the bed, her face flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and labored. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by illness, and Edmund felt his throat tighten with guilt and grief. Anna sat beside the bed, holding her mother's hand, and when she looked up at Edmund's entrance, he saw that she had been crying. But when their eyes met, despite everything between them, despite the pain and separation and broken promises, she smiled with genuine relief and gratitude. "You came," Anna whispered. "I wasn't sure you would, but I knew I had to try. Mother is dying, Edmund. The local physician says there's nothing more he can do, but I thought, maybe in London, maybe there are better doctors, newer treatments." Edmund moved to the other side of the bed and looked down at Beatrice, this woman who had inadvertently changed his life, whose dignity in the face of his cruelty had sparked his transformation. He could not let her die without trying everything possible to save her. "Master Robert," Edmund said, turning to the royal physician who had traveled with him at his insistence, "what can be done?" The physician examined Beatrice carefully, checking her pulse, looking at her eyes and tongue, asking questions about her symptoms and the progression of the illness. Finally, he straightened and spoke with careful precision. "The fever has taken a strong hold, but she's otherwise healthy and younger than many who have succumbed to this illness. There are treatments we can try, new compounds based on Arabic medicine that have shown some promise. But Your Highness, you should know that staying here exposes you to serious danger. This fever is highly contagious, and you could easily fall ill yourself." "Then I'll deal with that if it happens," Edmund replied. "Do whatever you can for her. Cost is no object. Use any treatment you think might help, and bring in more physicians if you need them, the best available. I want everything possible done." Over the next 3 days, Edmund refused to leave the estate despite repeated messages from London demanding his return. He stayed with Beatrice and Anna, helping to care for the sick woman, fetching water and medicine, changing cold compresses when her fever spiked, reading to her during her lucid moments when she was strong enough to listen. Anna worked beside him, their shared purpose creating a temporary truce in the emotional distance that had existed between them since their separation. During those long hours of vigil, as they worked to save Beatrice's life, Edmund and Anna talked more honestly than they had in months. They spoke of the pain of separation, of the difficulty of trying to move on, of the persistent ache of loving someone they could not have. They spoke of Edmund's impending marriage, and Anna surprised him by saying she understood his choice, that she had come to see that sometimes love was not enough, that duty and responsibility had their own validity even when they conflicted with personal desire. "I don't hate you, Edmund," Anna said one night as they sat beside Beatrice's sleeping form, both exhausted but unable to rest. "I never did, even when the pain was worst. I'm angry at circumstances, at the unfairness of a world where two people who care for each other cannot be together simply because of who their parents were. But I'm not angry at you. You tried to find a way. You would have given up everything if it were possible. That matters to me." Edmund took her hand without thinking, the gesture natural after days of working side by side. "You're more generous than I deserve. I made you promises I couldn't keep, gave you hope that I should have known was false. I caused you pain when you had already suffered enough. You also gave me joy," Anna countered. "You made me feel valued and loved in a way I never had before. You showed me that I was worth more than I thought, that I deserved respect and kindness and consideration. Even if we cannot be together, that gift remains. You changed my life, Edmund, and mostly for the better. Don't discount that because of how it ended." On the fourth day, Beatrice's fever finally broke. She woke with clear eyes for the first time in over a week, weak and exhausted, but unmistakably on the path to recovery. Master Robert pronounced her out of danger, though she would need weeks of rest and careful nursing before she would be fully restored to health. Edmund felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not fully realized he was carrying, relief flooding through him so powerfully that he had to sit down. "You saved her," Anna said, tears of joy rather than grief now streaming down her face. "You saved my mother, Edmund. How can I ever thank you?" Edmund looked at this young woman he loved, at her tear-stained face and exhausted smile, and felt something shift inside him. The emptiness that had consumed him since their separation was still there, but it was no longer absolute. In these days of working to save Beatrice, of being reminded of why he had first tried to change, he had rediscovered a sense of purpose that went beyond mere duty. He was reminded that being a prince meant using his power to help others, to make a difference in individual lives, to honor the trust that had been placed in him by accident of birth. "You don't need to thank me," Edmund said quietly. "I did only what I should have done from the beginning, what my father would have done without hesitation. Beatrice is a good woman who deserved my help, not my cruelty. And you, Anna, you deserve all the happiness in the world. I cannot give you that, but at least I could give you this, your mother's life, and a future where you're not alone." He stood, knowing that he needed to leave before his resolve weakened, before he did something foolish that would hurt them both even more. "I need to return to London. The wedding cannot be delayed any longer, and I've already stretched my brother's patience to its limit. But I'm leaving Master Robert here to oversee your mother's recovery, and I'm making additional arrangements for your comfort and security. You'll never want for anything, Anna. That much I can ensure." Anna rose as well, and for a moment they stood facing each other, both aware that this was truly goodbye, that there would be no more chances for private conversations or stolen moments. The life that Edmund had to live and the life that Anna needed to build were diverging permanently, two paths that had crossed briefly but could not run parallel. "Be happy, Edmund," Anna said, repeating the words she had spoken months ago in the solar at Ravenshold. "Or if not happy, then at least at peace. You're a good man, better than you know. Lady Catherine is fortunate to have you, even if she doesn't realize it. And I will always treasure what we had, even if we can never have it again." Edmund wanted to kiss her one final time, to hold her close and memorize the feeling of her in his arms, but he knew that would only make the parting harder. Instead, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, a gesture of respect and farewell, and then turned and walked away before his courage could fail him. The ride back to London was different from all his other journeys. Edmund was not happy exactly, but neither was he consumed by the emptiness that had characterized recent months. He had been reminded of his purpose, of the reason he needed to be a good prince even if he could not have the personal happiness he desired. He had saved Beatrice's life, had honored his father's memory by acting as his father would have acted, and in doing so had found a measure of peace with the choices he had made. The wedding took place as scheduled, a magnificent ceremony in the royal chapel attended by nobles from across England and representatives from several foreign courts. Edmund spoke his vows clearly and without hesitation, placed the wedding ring on Lady Catherine's finger, and accepted her as his wife with all the dignity and solemnity the occasion demanded. Catherine was beautiful in her gown of white silk embroidered with gold, her golden hair crowned with flowers, and if she noticed that her husband's eyes held a distant sadness, she gave no sign, maintaining the serene smile that was her constant expression. The wedding feast lasted until dawn, 300 guests consuming impossible quantities of food and wine while musicians played and dancers performed. Edmund played his part, accepting congratulations and making appropriate toasts, but part of his mind was elsewhere, remembering another celebration, a smaller and more genuine one, with a young woman whose smile had been real rather than practiced, whose laughter had come from true joy rather than polite obligation. But when the sun rose the next morning on the first day of his married life, Edmund rose with it, determined to honor the promise he had made to Anna, to be good even if he could not be happy, to use his position to help others, to be the prince his father had wanted him to be. It would not be the life he had dreamed of during those precious months with Anna, but it would be a life of meaning and purpose, and perhaps that would have to be enough. Years passed, and Edmund settled into his role as a married prince and eventually, after Richard's death from illness, as king. He and Catherine produced 3 children, a duty performed rather than a joy shared, but Edmund was a good father to them, determined that they would grow up understanding both the privileges and the responsibilities of their position. He ruled justly and well, remembered for his fairness in judgment and his concern for the common people, his willingness to listen to petitions and to use his power to help those who could not help themselves. He never forgot Anna, though he saw her only once more in his life, at Beatrice's funeral 10 years after his wedding. She had married a merchant, a good man who loved her and gave her 3 children of her own, and she seemed content if not deliriously happy. They spoke briefly, the conversation constrained by the presence of others and the weight of time and distance. But in her eyes he saw the same understanding that had been there that last night at the estate, gratitude for what they had shared, acceptance of what could not be, and a lasting affection that transcended the circumstances that had kept them apart. Edmund returned to his duties after that final meeting, carrying with him the knowledge that he had made the right choice, however much it had cost him. He had chosen duty over love, responsibility over personal happiness, and in doing so had honored both his father's legacy and Anna's faith in his ability to be a good man. It was not the ending that stories promised, with true love conquering all and everyone living happily ever after. But it was an ending marked by integrity, by growth, by the recognition that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. As Edmund sat on his throne years later, hearing petitions from his subjects and trying to render judgment with wisdom and compassion, he would sometimes think back to a cold winter day when he had mocked a desperate woman seeking work, never imagining how that moment of cruelty would change everything. He thought of Beatrice's dignity, of Anna's love, of the journey from arrogant prince to the man he had become, and though his heart still carried an ache that time had dulled but never erased, he knew that he had become someone his father would have been proud of, someone who used power to serve rather than to dominate, someone who understood that being a good ruler meant sometimes sacrificing personal happiness for the greater good. It was not the life he had wanted, but it was a life of meaning, and in the end, perhaps that was the greatest happiness of all, not to have everything he desired, but to know that he had used what he was given to make a difference, to honor those who had believed in him, and to leave the world a bit better than he had found it. And sometimes, in quiet moments, he would remember a young woman with dark hair and honest eyes who had taught him what it meant to truly love, and he would whisper a silent prayer of thanks for the gift she had given him, even though they could never share a life together. The prince had laughed at the obese woman who came to ask for work, but what followed had indeed made him cry. Yet those tears, painful as they were, had washed away his cruelty and arrogance, leaving behind a man capable of real compassion, genuine love, and the kind of sacrifice that defined true nobility. And that, Edmund came to believe, was the real happy ending, not the fairy tale romance, but the transformation of a soul, the redemption of a heart, and the knowledge that even when we cannot have what we most desire, we can still become who we are meant to be.